If you play video games, you've heard of Mario. There's no avoiding the king of video games. Mario has produced back-to-back bestsellers for the last 40 years, and there's no sign of that stopping anytime soon. After all, Mario is the best-selling video game franchise ever, and by a country mile at that. And with the series also boasting some of the most critically acclaimed games of all time, it shouldn't come as any shock to hear what an enduring legacy Mario has behind it. With all that being said, I have a confession to make. I've never been a big fan of Mario. I know, it's taboo to say such a thing, but what you have to understand is that I'm an old man, and back in dinosaur times, there was this company called Sega that used to make video game consoles, and they had this little blue mascot who also headed his own franchise of incredibly successful platforming video games. I believe his name was Ogilvy, or something to that effect. Now, as his popularity waned and the times changed, most reasonable people moved on from their Sega consoles in favor of buying a more modern alternative, something like the Sony PlayStation or the Nintendo 64. But there were some gamers out there who still frantically clung onto their Sega brand loyalty, and thus stubbornly bought the company's last great hurrah into the console market, the Sega Dreamcast. My dad was one of those people. As such, I grew up a Sega kid, and you'll never guess what my first video game was. Yeah, that one. That was my first video game. How the hell did I get into this hobby? Honestly, I don't know if it really is as bad as everyone says it is, or if that's all just slander, and I did in fact start with an amazing game. But to me, as a child, this shit was off the chain. It had it all. Spin dashing, homing attacks, shitty third-person shooter sections, and who can forget the best part of all?
Alright, Froggy. Motherfucker, just cast the fucking lure, you piece of garbage.
Do it.
Get it.
Go for the
like
gold.
it. Want it. Have it. Need it. Why? Why?
Okay, maybe this game did suck ass, but regardless of whether or not it did, I felt, as a kid, like Sonic was the pinnacle of platformer gaming, and Mario, by contrast, never really excited me. In fact, the only Mario game I think I ever even finished as a kid was Super Mario Galaxy, and even then, I'd never bothered to collect all the stars in that game. I just got to the end credits, and then put it down forever. Likewise, the first time I played Super Mario 64, I was initially put off by how seemingly unresponsive Mario was to my commands, and how slippery the controls felt. In fact, there are a lot of people today who feel the same way about this game. They pick up the controller, hate the way Mario moves, and then put it down, never to try playing it again. I went through the same charade in my childhood, back in dinosaur times, except, key difference, I did try playing it again, this time as an adult, and instead of putting the game down after a couple minutes, I kept playing, and playing, and playing, and eventually improving, until one moment, I came to a sudden and incredible realization, one that I never think I'll ever experience with a video game again. I realized that the controls in this game were so precise, so airtight, and so incredible to behold that I actually started to cry a bit, because I knew I'd never play a game like this ever again. Today, I want to answer why it is that this game continues to endure as one of Nintendo's most beloved titles, and how it still manages to touch its player base in a way that seldom other games from the 3D platformer genre do. I'm going to analyze and critique this game in excruciating detail, picking apart its controls, physics, level design, and more, in the pursuit of understanding just what makes Super Mario 64 the wonderful game that it is. Hello! Here's a quandary for you. How can an artist make something that no one has ever even attempted to make before? Where do you even begin when charting into completely unknown creative territory? It's a difficult conundrum, to be sure, because in truth, all new works of art draw influences from previous ones in some capacity, and video games are no exception to this rule. To quote Dan Houser, executive producer at Rockstar Games, anyone who makes 3D games who says they've not borrowed something from Mario or Zelda is lying. I've talked at great length before on this channel about Zelda's influence on developers, particularly that first games, but Mario's impact on the video game industry is arguably even greater than that of Zelda's. What's even more miraculous is that both of these games were produced by the same two creative minds, Takashi Tezuka and Shigeru Miyamoto. It's impressive enough for a developer to create one industry-defining game franchise, but two? I genuinely believe that Miyamoto and Tezuka are the only two video game developers alive who could possibly boast such an impressive feat as that. But even with two visionaries like these guys leading the charge, a jump into the three-dimensional is still a monumental task. How do we take a game where the player could only move left or right, up or down, and translate that into a new one where he can move in literally every conceivable direction possible for a three-dimensional object? Programming the movement for such a character is hard enough to imagine, but then designing levels for a game like that? Now we have two monumental hurdles for a single development team of only about 15 people to tackle. And they had to do all that in less than 2 years. A lesser developer would be crushed underneath such an impossible task. But this is Nintendo we're talking about here. And when it comes to making brand new experiences, good and bad, no company is more brazen and bold than Nintendo. Luckily then for Tezuka and Miyamoto, Nintendo has a general design philosophy surrounding their games that came in handy for this title in particular. They begin development by designing the player character's movement first, then build the level design around the way that character moves. In this way, a Nintendo game's levels serve as a playground of sorts for your character's specific movements. And in Super Mario 64, movement takes precedence over all other aspects of the game. It should come as no surprise to hear that the majority of Miyamoto's time working on the game was spent on getting the movement down pat. The idea was to give the player as many tools as possible, and in that pursuit, Miyamoto had Mario's animations made first, with the programming coming afterwards. The game's assistant director, Yoshiaki Koizumi, had originally started out at the company as an artist, and so he personally led the charge and created some 250 animation patterns for Mario, 193 of which made it into the final game. With this, the programmers got to work implementing all of 3D Mario's vast moveset, but something was still missing. Control. For the first half a year of development, the team had nothing but keyboards and modified Sega controllers to move Mario with, and they knew something was missing almost instantly. Hell, I can personally attest from having tried using keyboard controls for this game that they just don't give you the precision that you need to control Mario with. No disrespect to PC gamers, I myself was a PC gamer for many years, but to be honest, the mouse and keyboard control layout is only really good for select games, like first-person shooters and RTS games. It can be serviceable for certain other titles which don't require precise movement to complete, but platformers are hell to play on PC, and from my experience of using emulators to capture footage for games I review, I can personally attest that 2D Zelda is also terrible to play with a keyboard. All of that's to say that Miyamoto knew from the get-go that in order to fully realize his vision for this new Mario game, as well as all future 3D games on the new Nintendo 64 console, the system needed more than just good software. It needed a control scheme that could provide players with what they valued most in a game: full control over their actions. And so, Miyamoto worked with Nintendo's hardware developers on creating a new controller that could match that demand. And they did that by borrowing an old control scheme that had not been seen since the days of the Atari 2600. They put a stick on a controller. This time though, the stick was not modeled off of an arcade scheme, like the Atari joystick was, but rather was made small enough to be controlled by a single appendage, the thumbstick, or, as it's more commonly known by these days, the analog stick. The result of this constant tweaking and adjusting for perfection was the new system's launch title, Super Mario 64. Now before we begin discussing this game's progression, world, and level design as I usually do, I'd like to begin this formal critique of the game exactly where Miyamoto began its development, with the movement. Mario's moveset in Super Mario 64 is larger and more diverse than in any other game in the series, and perhaps even in all of the 3D platformer genre. With the A button, Mario can not only jump, but also double jump, then triple jump in order to gain progressively more air. With the B button, he can perform a simple punch, or an air kick, or even dive if the player is running or jumping fast enough. All of these moves can be used to attack, but several of them can also be used to enhance Mario's moveset. The air kick, for example, keeps Mario afloat for a bit longer, and can therefore assist the player in controlling his descent. The dive can really enhance Mario's movement, since it launches Mario forward and can be performed at any altitude. Still, if you want the most distance out of Mario's jumps, you'll have to turn to the long jump. By pressing the Z button, Mario will crouch, and doing so while running forward will put Mario into a sliding crouch. Pressing A while in this state makes Mario perform a long jump, which grants Mario the most speed and distance of any move in the game, but at the cost of altitude, since it's also his shortest jump. You can also jump while still in a crouch, which makes Mario perform a backwards flip. This grants Mario great height without much of a fuss, but still not as great as successfully performing a triple jump. You can also flick the analog stick back and press A while Mario's in a run, which will make him perform a somersault. This move is slightly better than the backwards flip, but requires more skill and some spare room with which to perform it. Now, are you noticing a pattern with these moves so far? Each and every single move in Mario's arsenal has a utility, but also a situational drawback. The more height or distance a move grants Mario, the more momentum he needs to perform it. You can't just triple jump by standing in place, for example. In order to fully execute it, you need to space Mario out accordingly and provide him with enough speed to pull it off. Likewise, the long jump requires that the player run and slide before jumping. He can't just pull off an advanced move like that from a standstill. This leads us into the driving element of Super Mario 64's gameplay loop: momentum. The physics in this game are so well crafted, and Mario's momentum and speed is implemented with such realism that all of his moves begin to feel natural once you get the hang of it. But it's not just the moves themselves that make Super Mario 64's controls feel so natural. It's in how they connect with one another. Once again, the triple jump is a good place to start. To perform it, you have to not only build up enough speed, but you also need to perform 1, 2, 3 correctly timed jumps in a row. Now, officially, this is where the move ends. Unofficially though, Mario is still free to lead this into a different move. After all, look at all the height and speed that was built up by this jump. So what can we do next? Then you can keep up the momentum and jump out of that onto a wall, dive again, and now we've landed in a fountain. That killed our momentum, thus ending our chain of movements. That's the key to understanding Mario's potential in this game. How do you build up speed? And when you do, how do you keep that speed going forward? There's no move in this game which can't, with enough momentum at your back, be chained into another move. That is why I said earlier that the backwards flip was less useful than the somersault. Sure, it's easier to pull off and requires no momentum to perform, but as a drawback, it also doesn't build any momentum. The animations in this game do an incredible job of conveying information like this to the player. Look at the way Mario lands after he performs the flip. It took all of his effort to pull that move off, and it shows. A somersault, by contrast, can be chained together with more somersaults, or a jump into a wall kick or a dive, because it needed momentum to perform. As a reward, it allows the player to connect with another move by building off of that momentum. Together, these are the elements that form the connective tissue of Super Mario 64's gameplay. Mario's advanced moveset allows him to build momentum and speed, which in turn aids in performing more moves, building more speed, and gaining more height, all serving to make Mario the acrobatic wonder that he is. And it's the player who has full control over this entire process. Miyamoto was right to begin development by fleshing out Mario's moveset first, because once he and the team had that incredible foundation set, making a fun game became a piece of cake. All they had to do now was create a world fit for Mario to play in. Seldom is there more an important part to a video game than its opening. And in the case of Super Mario 64, the opening is one of the best examples of intelligent tutorial design in all of gaming history. But you wouldn't know it at first glance. The area outside of Peach's castle is so quiet and subdued. It stands in stark contrast to Miyamoto's last game, A Link to the Past. In that one, the player was rushed to Zelda's rescue. Link had been told telepathically that Zelda was in trouble, and the player was expected to read tutorials and learn controls on the way there. This time, it's the exact opposite. Mario couldn't be any more blissfully unaware of Peach's current predicament, and the complete absence of a soundtrack pushing the player forward, combined with the peaceful scenery and the serene sounds of nature, are subtle clues aiming to convey to the player that they have all the time in the world to explore and familiarize themselves with the game, and that maybe they should stop for a moment and smell the roses. Obviously, there are tutorial signs placed just about everywhere, all of which contain vital information regarding the controls. But there's more to this area than meets the eye, for it is the simplest of things we see in this opening section that matter the most. The hills, the trees, the lake, the bridge. All of these environmental elements come together to provide the player with a safe, wide-open area for him to practice Mario's moveset in. Right at the start, the player can walk up the hills, which will slow Mario's movement on the incline, but increase it on the decline. There are trees to climb, which Mario can jump off of to increase his jumping distance. There are steep slopes behind the player which box him into the tutorial area, and a small lake and moat nearby where the player can learn to swim. In its entirety, this little area outside of Peach's castle serves as a microcosm for all of the basic environments that the player will see throughout the entire game. Inclines and declines, trees and lakes, narrow bridges and tall slopes. If the player takes the time to explore just this one tiny area and try out Mario's moveset, he can learn all he needs to know about the controls in this game before even beginning the first level. The best part of all is that this is entirely at the whim of the player. If you don't want to read the signs or explore, you can just go straight to the castle with zero impediment. But if you ever need an area to practice, you can always come back here. Perhaps it's for that reason that every time the player boots up a save file, they'll start not inside the castle, but right back where they started, out in this little tutorial area. It's always here for you, should you need it. There is one vital aspect to the game though that's introduced to all players regardless of how much time they choose to spend out here: the camera. All games, 2D or 3D, have cameras, which in the context of animated media is simply a term used to refer to the relative position that the animation is being viewed from. In other words, if what we're seeing on screen were a live-action film shot in the real world, the term camera represents where the actual physical camera would have to be in order for the audience to view the scene from that particular angle. To help illustrate this concept to new players, there are actual physical cameramen in the game whom the player has some control over, the Lakitu Bros. I'll talk about the actual camera controls in a moment because that's a whole topic in and of itself. But as an introduction to general camera controls, the Lakitu Bros serve their function quite well. The initial shot of one flying across the opening scenery and focusing in on Mario as he exits the warp pipe establishes the concept well, and I'm sure it blew people's minds back when these graphics were considered good. Now with all of those compliments out of the way, let's talk about the camera itself. It kinda sucks balls. In fact, it's my only major complaint about the entire game. Everything else is pretty minor in comparison to this one glaring issue. The camera in Super Mario 64 is a bit of an enigma because it's a hybrid between fixed 3D camera angles and a semi-player controlled 3D camera. In other words, there's a default fixed camera angle for every part of the game, but you can also move the camera at a moment's notice and it'll listen to you sometimes. Other times you'll just hear this. For some reason that I cannot for the life of me come to understand, the devs made it impossible for the player to control the Lakitu Bros during several sections of the game. This means that if you need to line up the camera for an upcoming jump and you hear this, you just can't. And you'll have to instead make do with whatever shitty camera angle the devs decided to give you at that exact moment. As you might imagine, this leads to some pretty bullshit deaths and a few controller throws. It's a compliment to this game that 95% of the time, failure feels like it's my own fault. The controls are so airtight that any death due to a failure on my end feels entirely justified. But that last 5% matters to some degree. And yeah, there are times, even after memorizing this game like the back of my hand, where the camera manages to fuck up my jumps and kill me. Then we have the more annoying yet less lethal flaw. camera control. You see, even when you are able to control the camera, it's never quite going to stick where you want it to stick. This was unfortunately a hardware issue. No one thought to put a second analog stick on a controller for camera movement just yet, so all Miyamoto and the team had to work with here were 4 yellow buttons called the C buttons. These acted in most games as a set of directional buttons, which, as it turns out, is one of the most uncomfortable ways to move a camera around. You have to press the C buttons every time you want to move the camera even just a bit, but you can't make precise adjustments either, since every press will jerk the camera around at a set amount of degrees. Worst of all, the camera won't always hold in that position, but will instead try to default to the appropriate fixed camera angle. This leads to some hilarious moments where you'll literally fight against the Lakido cameraman, constantly mashing the C button to get him to stay in one place. This is video game hell, and is easily one of the most outdated aspects of the game, as well as the biggest turnoff to potential new players. I don't want to be too harsh on Miyamoto and the team here, because in their defense, they had absolutely no reference point for this sort of thing, and clearly worked really hard on trying to get it right. According to the team's one and only Western developer, Giles Goddard, Miyamoto had no idea what to do with the game's camera, and changed it thousands of times over the course of development. And in the historical context of this game's development, no one had this shit down by 1996. Plug in a PlayStation 1 and tell me how many games before Mario 64 had a good camera. 0. No one knew what the fuck they were doing. 3D was new, it was terrifying, and there was zero precedent for developers to work off of. So in that sense, it's commendable that even with all of the crazy locations, elevation changes, and acrobatics that occur in this game, that the camera still manages to work enough of the time for the game to even function, let alone actually be fun. All of that being said, the camera in Super Mario 64 is still quite bad, and no amount of historical context justifying the hows and whys of it can change that fact. Moving on from the game's controls, let's begin talking about the basic progression and goals of Super Mario 64. Upon entering Peach's castle, the first thing players will see when turning the corner is this little Toad character, who, when spoken to, will explain the game's basic plot. Bowser has taken over the castle and stolen its power star in order to make a world of his own in the paintings and the walls. Naturally, one may begin to ask a few questions at this point, like, what is star power? Why does the castle need it? And why is Bowser kidnapping Peach? These questions won't be answered because the story is treated with about as much care as I treat the penguin at the top of Cool Cool Mountain. It's kind of the anti-Zelda 3 in that sense, introducing a bunch of concepts and then failing to elaborate on them in any way, shape, or form. Is that a bad thing? I mean, kind of, because it makes me question why the devs even bothered putting in story elements like this if they're not going to build off of them. But it also isn't a blatant embarrassment like the history bitches in Zelda 3 were. Did somebody call me? No! But I just want to explain the history of the Triforce in excruciating detail. Get the fuck out of here, Zelda! Aww. Okay, I'll be waiting until we get to the Link Between Worlds video. So yeah, nothing like that happens in this game. And that's a plus, but it's still strange for a game to introduce such a wacky concept like star power and then never elaborate on it going forward. The goal of this game is to collect 70 out of 120 power stars, which Toad alluded to earlier, but there are smaller goals along the way that open up more and more of the castle. For example, when we start out at the beginning here, there is only one course available for the player, Bob-omb Battlefield. This is the tutorial level and will teach the player most of the concepts he should expect from all the future levels. All the player needs to do is collect 1 star from this course, any 1 star, and bam, he's unlocked the second level. Collect another 2 stars for a total of 3, and bam, levels 3 and 4 are now available as well. This is no mere illusion of choice either. Each level from this game has 7 stars to find, including Bob-omb Battlefield. This means that the player has 7 different stars he could go after in the first level alone. And once he collects even 1 of these stars, he'll unlock level 2, as well as the ability to find 2 of the castle's secret stars. This leaves a total of 16 stars for the player to choose from, of which only 3 are needed to unlock levels 3 and 4. Now there are 31 stars to find, which is not only more than enough to meet the first Bowser level's 8-star requirement, but it's also enough to exceed the second Bowser level's 30-star requirement. Not that you have to collect all the stars from here though, because after beating Bowser's first level, another 4 levels will open up, for a total of 8 separate courses totaling some 65 stars in all. Beating the second Bowser level then opens up the last 6 levels, and now the player can choose to collect any star he wants. Freedom is the central concept of this game, from the way Mario moves, to the design of the levels, and yes, even to the hub world itself. The player chooses which level he wants to play, what star he wants to tackle, and which secret stars he wants to find. Whole levels can be skipped, and entire sections of the castle can remain unexplored. Or, if you're a completionist like me, you can play this game for all it's got and collect all 120 stars. The choice is yours, and yours alone, and the hub world reflects that choice so incredibly well that it's honestly astonishing to me that this was the team's first 3D game. Speaking of firsts, let's move on to talking about this game's 15 main levels, or courses as they're called in this game. Starting with Course 1, Bob-omb Battlefield. This was the first level the development team had fully designed, and it shows. Practically every major element of future course design in Super Mario 64 is present in this one stage in some capacity. Yet, each one of them is made simple enough for the player to practice with and come to understand without much consequence. Take the red Bob-ombs, for example. These guys will appear in every single level of the game from here on out, and provide the player with a valuable service through the cannons they have placed throughout the game world. As such, they sit right at the start, clearly docile, waiting for the player to interact with. Should the player talk to them, they'll explain Mario's basic objective for obtaining this course's first star, and will tell the player to come speak to them afterwards so they can open up the cannons for him. This imparts to the player the vital role that some NPCs, particularly these red Bob-ombs, will play in many of the game's future courses, which is vital information for collecting several future stars. Next, Goombas and black Bob-ombs make their appearance. These are the game's first 2 enemies, and are some of the most common. The Goombas are essentially squishies that can be punched, kicked, or jumped on to kill. Easy stuff. But the Bob-ombs are a little more complicated. They will try to suicide bomb Mario should he get too close, but the player can counter this by either picking them up and throwing them, or kicking them away before they explode. This is a more complex enemy type, one that can't simply be jumped on like in previous Mario games. To kill them, you need to use a move that involves the B button in some way. Therefore, these 2 enemy types teach the player valuable information about the game's combat. No 2 enemies are the same, and while jumping on top of enemies can still work in some cases, most will require some sort of trick in order to kill, either by grabbing, punching, or kicking them. All of these NPC interactions occur at the beginning of the level, right before a steep cliff that stands between Mario and the rest of the course. To ascend it, the player has 2 options, the bridge or a revolving set of platforms. The bridge is easier, but at the top of the platforms lies a suspicious and intriguing looking red coin, which will naturally draw one's attention. This is the game's subtle way of encouraging the player to try these things out, where he'll start to learn their pattern. They revolve in a vertical, ovular shape and dump the player off at the end. This might seem like a minor part of the level design. After all, it's the only revolving platform in all of Bob-omb Battlefield, so why am I even focusing on it? Well, because for as minor as this little elevator system may seem right now, it will eventually become an integral part of several later levels platforming challenges, and this little red coin at the top is the dev's way of encouraging the player to toy around with them and figure out their patterns now. In fact, the red coins in this level are all put in deliberate locations which encourage the player to try out different level elements that will appear in future courses. The second one, for example, is at the top of an incline, teaching players basic physics involving upwards and downwards momentum. The third lies on top of a post behind this chain chomp, subtly hinting at the importance it will have in acquiring a future star. And then we have this coin sitting at the top of this grassy slope. Players who try to jump up to it will find that they just slide down. Some inclines, it seems, are just too steep for Mario to climb, so the player will be forced, instead, to acquire it by sliding down the slope, which will introduce the player to the physics and controls of Mario when he's sliding. These are all vital concepts which will reappear throughout the game's runtime, and the red coins manage to motivate players to interact with them both through the virtue of their unique coloring and the coin encounter that they provide upon collection. Bob-omb Battlefield is filled to the brim with subtle teaching tools like this one, which all serve to introduce the game's core level design concepts. The mountain itself is a wonderful example of this. At its base lies a pit full of rolling rocks, which the player will quickly learn the danger of, should he run into them. Upon getting past them and turning the corner, he'll soon find that these rocks are also rolling down the path leading up the mountain, but luckily there's more than enough room for the player to just avoid them, and a grassy patch up ahead will provide a small reprieve for the player as well. But past this point, going further up the mountain, the challenge will escalate. The path becomes more narrow, gaps create opportunities for the player to fall and take damage, and black bombs provide secondary obstacles on top of the rocks and gaps. Still, for as daunting as this may seem, this is actually an extremely forgiving set of challenges. No fall is fatal, as long as the player has some health left to spare, and a surplus of coins line the pathway to provide players with ways to recover said health. What this mountain's rather forgiving design aims to do then is serve as a sort of tutorial platforming challenge, providing incrementally more difficult paths and jumps to navigate through, thus introducing the player to the concept of 3D platforming. This is brilliant game design, and is especially important given that this was the very first 3D platformer to use an analog stick. The expectation was that gamers would rightfully feel intimidated by the change in both perspective and controls, so Bob-omb Battlefield was designed to teach players all they had to know about this game's level design, while also being extremely forgiving in its punishments for failure. Too many 3D platforms at the time tried translating the genre one-to-one from its 2D counterpart, challenging the player with jumps that require pixel-perfect accuracy in order to pull off. There were even several members of Mario 64's development team who were insistent on doing the same, and according to Miyamoto, were not happy to see the rather forgiving nature of Super Mario 64's platforming challenges. But Miyamoto was the one actually playtesting the game throughout its entire development cycle, constantly playing around with Mario's controls, and he figured out during this process that pinpoint precision jumps like the ones that made 2D platformers challenging simply did not work in their 3D equivalent. The new axis, coupled with the massive increase in pixel count, made it impossible for players to accurately understand the position of Mario relative to each and every platform in the game. The shitty camera probably didn't help with that either, but Miyamoto obviously never admitted that. So on his command, the levels were designed in such a way that platforming challenges could be completed in several different ways. Take the gaps on the way to Bob-omb Battlefield's mountain, for instance. Sure, you can triple jump over them, but you can also long jump, or double jump and dive, or cross the narrow wooden board that bridges the gaps between some of them. The challenge here isn't in performing one jump perfectly, but rather in finding out what best works for you, the player, and executing that move effectively. Earlier, I mentioned that freedom was central to the design of Super Mario 64, and I meant that in more ways than one. Big decisions like which stages to play and which stars to get are obviously a part of that, but even the little decisions, the little moments of gameplay, are rife with player choice and freedom. In what way will you clear this gap? How do you want to scale this cliff? Which star do you want to go for, and how do you want to get that star? These are questions the player will constantly have to answer, because there's no one rigid way to do things in this game. In Super Mario 64, the sky is the limit. So now that I just spent the last 5 minutes sucking this game's dick, let's move on to talking about the worst part about Bob-omb Battlefield, the boss fight with King Bob-omb. King Bob-omb commits what I consider to be a cardinal sin of game design, openly announcing his weakness at the beginning of the fight. Now, I'm sure a lot of fans of this game would defend this interaction by saying, oh, he's just trying to teach the player how combat in this game works. After all, it is the very first boss fight in 3D Mario, and that's a fair point. I was also ready to defend it on those grounds, because the way you fight King Bob-omb is the same way you fight Bowser. You need to get behind him, grab him with the B button, then throw him to deal damage. At first glance, it therefore seems like the purpose of this boss fight is to prepare the player for future ones, right? But here's the thing. Bowser also yells out his weaknesses at the beginning of his fight, as does the Whomp King, and iRock, and Wiggler, and... wait, hold on a second. Those are all the bosses in the game? The boss fights in this game suck, and that's in large part because each and every one of them babies the player in this exact same way. The only fight that doesn't fall completely flat on its face is the last one against Bowser, because it does something that none of the other bosses in this game do. It actually escalates the challenge that previous iterations of the fight built upon, and respects the player's intelligence enough to not have Bowser yell out his weakness at the start. I'm sure whoever designed the boss fights in this game was trying to do something smart here, but he clearly wasn't confident enough in his work to just have the later bosses shut up and let the player figure out for himself how to take them down. What makes it even more insulting and less understandable from a design perspective is that this first fight is easy as all hell. King Bob-omb can't even do any damage to you unless you run headfirst into his body. All he can do is grab you and throw you, sometimes off the edge of the mountain, but usually just onto the grass. But then again, he'll probably never even be able to do that anyway because he needs to catch you first. You know, like, eventually. You know, he's gonna catch you one day. Could really go for a sandwich right now. So yeah, this guy's boss fight sucks. Luckily, it doesn't have a huge impact on the level's overall quality, because unlike in a Zelda game, the boss fights here are hardly the culmination of any given level, since they only provide a single star out of the level's total of 7. Speaking of which, let's talk a bit about the stars in this game. I mentioned earlier that there are a total of 120 stars, only 70 of which are needed to beat the game. Each course in the game has a total of 7 stars each, 5 of which are hidden throughout the unique level design of that course. The last 2 are the red coin and 100 coin stars. Every level has these. The red coins I talked about on Bob-omb Battlefield earlier are the same red coins necessary to collect in order to obtain the red coin star. There are 8 of them in every level, and upon collecting the last of them, a star will appear. The 100 coin star is similar in concept. Collect 100 coins from throughout the course, and you'll be rewarded with a star. While the prerequisites for making these stars appear remain the same in every course, the design of the course itself adds variety to these stars. Some levels have plenty of coins, others barely have enough. Some spread red coins throughout the map, while others condense them all in a single puzzle room or hidden area. The quality of the stars themselves, or rather the locations of the stars, varies from stage to stage, but for the most part they're quite good at enhancing the player's sense of freedom, while also providing wonderful platforming challenges or puzzles. Take Bob-omb Battlefield, for instance. I just detailed the method in which you acquired the first star, through killing King Bob-omb, but even though the level select screen technically lists this as the first star, you're never forced to get a certain star first. Remember that third red coin I mentioned behind the chain chomp? If you ground pound on the wooden post it sits upon, you can free the chain chomp, who will then destroy a set of metal bars that house a star. You can do this at any time you want, even before taking on King Bob-omb. The 100 coin star is also an option. Granted, it requires deep knowledge of the level layout and great skill on the player's part to complete, but it's entirely possible to collect 100 coins all before even fighting King Bob-omb. Of course, there are some stars that require you complete a certain objective first. That's because upon completing specific stars, the level layout will change going forward. Killing King Bob-omb, for example, opens up the race with Koopa the Quick, because he'll only show up after the king is dead. The finish line is, after all, the king's former boss arena. It just wouldn't make sense to have these 2 stars available at the same time. Also, killing the king and talking to the red Bob-ombs will, as mentioned previously, open up this level's cannons, which the player can use to launch himself to the floating island in the sky. Up there lies both the final red coin, allowing the player to acquire that star, as well as a completely separate star that's simply there to reward players for getting up there in the first place. That's only 6 stars, because the 7th requires the wing cap to get, which is something we'll talk about later, but for now, I'm sure you can see just how much variety and choice the 7-star system in Super Mario 64 provides the player. There is one flaw, however, with the star system that I'd like to address. You see, collecting any star in this game will boot the player out of the level, and to collect more, he has to go back in and start the course all over again. Now, on the face of things, I'm sure that's going to annoy some players, because retrekking the same level over and over again while the game keeps booting the player out after completing an objective sounds pretty terrible. But in Super Mario 64's case, I actually believe this is a fine mechanic, because these levels are all quite small, open, and compact. Rarely will a level force the player to retread the exact same path for every single star. That's the thing though. Rarely will it do that, but sometimes it does, and these repeat stars, as I like to call them, can be a real pain in the ass to collect, since they just start to feel like blatant padding after a while. They aren't common, but they do exist, and I'll be sure to mention them as we continue along in analyzing this game's level design, because they do mar the design of more than a few levels in this game. Moving on from Bob-omb Battlefield, Course 2, Whomp's Fortress, seeks to escalate the platforming challenges introduced in the first level. Right off the bat, the player has two choices for traversal up to the fortress. One that requires some complex jumps to clear, and another simpler path with some platforming challenges of its own. Here, some push blocks will seek to knock the player off the walkway as he attempts to pass, which will knock the player down to a grassy field below. This is a pretty low stakes punishment, but the next set of challenges, some moving floors, seek to escalate that challenge by killing the player outright with the game's first bottomless pits. You see, Whomp's Fortress takes place in the sky. Unlike with the first level, fall off the ledge and Mario is dead. No exceptions. Of course, the level design is still conscious of the fact that this stage is only the second in the game. These challenges at the beginning are the first and only bottomless pits in the level, after all, but the concept is being introduced here all the same, which is vital considering how prevalent pits like these will become as the game goes on. The game's first collapsing and rotating bridges are also introduced in this level. This time, they only lie over a slope leading down to the fortress below, so players aren't going to be punished so harshly for falling off them just yet. But once again, these exist to introduce the concept, so that the later levels can build up their difficulty without the player being completely thrown off by them. Speaking of which, those revolving platforms from Bob-omb Battlefield now make their first mandatory appearance, since the only way up to the boss fight itself will be to get on one of the platforms and jump off right before they reach the top. Again, while this is a low stakes challenge, it's meant to serve as an escalation of the mechanic and prepare the player for greater challenges lying ahead. At the top of the fortress lies the boss of Course 2. The Whomp King. Once again, he confidently yells out the method of his own demise right before the fight, but I'll at least give him some points for actually possessing the ability to hurt the player. Still, all you need to do to beat him, as the king implies, is wait for the Whomp to attack, then ground pound him 3 times to win the fight and retrieve the first star. Like I said, none of these boss fights are good, but they also aren't the end-all be-all of each course's level design. But here's where Course 2 does begin to get a bit irksome, because the second star requires that the player climb the exact same fortress, get to where you fought the Whomp King, then platform up the easiest tower imaginable to reach the star. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the first of the game's repeat stars, as I referred to them earlier. It's a star that is in the exact same location as before, but this time, you only have to platform a slightly different set of jumps at the end to reach it. If it weren't for the fact that this game literally boots the player out of the level after acquiring each star, then acquiring a repeat star would only take a couple seconds more of game time. But because the player has to start the level over from scratch after collecting each star, now this is suddenly considered a second star, even though its acquisition is almost exactly the same as the first stars. This is blatant padding and does nothing to further the challenge of this level, nor teach the player any vital lessons about the game's design. Luckily, that's the only bad star on this stage. The red coin star requires some deep exploration of the map and a few key jumps to acquire, while the 100 coin star isn't too difficult to nab up so long as you're thorough in scouting out the level's nooks and crannies. Speaking of which, the third star is hidden in a little alcove in the side of a wall, and the player can either perform some advanced jumping to reach it, or unlock the cannon and shoot themselves into it. Now, I'm sure those of you who've never played the game before are about to ask, how would a player know how to do that? Well, if you've been reading the text that appears on the level select screen upon jumping into each painting, you'll likely have noticed by now that the names of each star also serve as hints to their many locations. And for star 3, the title is Shoot into the Wild Blue. This hints at use of the cannon, because what else can we shoot with in Mario? And with that information in hand, looking for the hidden alcove along the map's skyline becomes a piece of cake. The last 2 stars also require use of these hints to find. fall onto the caged island hints at the use of Hoot, a friendly little animal companion who the player can grab onto and use to fly above the cage to fall into. Alternatively, you could pull off some insane jumps to get in there instead, or even shoot yourself into the cage using the cannon. Like I said, this game rarely ever boxes the player into one rigid way of completing its tasks. Ironically though, the last star on this stage does just that. Blast away the wall is just as it sounds. The player has to use the cannon from earlier to blast away a wall and reveal the hidden star within. Still, while the actual collection of this star is quite straightforward, it does serve to impart on the player just how much control he has over the level geometry, a concept which will serve him well in many of the game's future courses. All in all, Whomp's Fortress serves as a brilliant next step in the game's difficulty and introduction of future level design concepts, while also providing several unique star challenges along the way. Course 3 is Jolly Roger Bay. Critically, as you may notice, it is also the game's very first water level. The swimming mechanics in this game are something that the player may already have a grasp on. After all, the tutorial area outside of Peach's castle provides the player with a chance to test the controls out for himself, and there's a sign nearby which explains everything the player needs to know. Basically, holding the A button will have Mario perform a constant but slow flutter kick, while tapping the button will instead perform a breaststroke. Just like with swimming in real life, timing is key to maximizing Mario's speed, and if you do it just right, he can end up swimming pretty damn fast, even rivaling the speed of his full run on land. On top of that, Mario's air meter is tied to his health, which means that recovering either air bubbles or coins will replenish the meter while underwater. This essentially allows the player to stay underwater indefinitely, because the level designs are actually quite generous with dealing out both air pockets and coins for the player to collect. This harmonious blend between advanced swimming controls and level designs which complement them end up making Mario 64's water levels some of the absolute best in the series. They accomplish what a good water level should, adding variety to the physics and controls of the game, while also pairing these new physics with appropriate level design and depth of their own for the player to master. Swimming, like running and jumping, requires skill to learn, but when the player finally manages to nail it down, he'll be able to pull off tricks and skips that new players would never have even dreamed of, adding some much needed depth to even the simple act of swimming. As the game's very first water level, Jolly Roger Bay itself introduces the concept quite brilliantly. Mario begins the level on a little sandbar, which houses some coins and a currently unusable metal cap block. Like I said earlier, we'll talk about these power-ups a bit later on. But other than these two little points of interest, there's really no other way for the player to go than straight into the bay. It is here where the seemingly empty Jolly Roger Bay begins to open up and reveal all it's got to the player. For you see, diving under the water reveals a great chasm with several points of interest for the player to explore. There are clams who damage players curious enough to touch them, red coins to collect, and most intriguing of all, a sunken ship at the very bottom of the bay. Exploration is key to acquiring the stars in Jolly Roger Bay, as is puzzle solving, a new element to the Mario formula which Miyamoto credited to influence from his ongoing Legend of Zelda series. The first puzzle in Jolly Roger Bay lies at the end of an underwater cove, in which 4 treasure chests lie hidden in the very back. A sign nearby presents the basic concept of the puzzle quite plainly. Through trial and error, the player must pick out the correct order in which to open the chests. Choosing an incorrect one will not only reset the puzzle, but also zap away some of the player's health. Memorization is key to solving this conundrum, and upon completion, a star will pop out of the final chest. This is simple, but it introduces the concept quite deftly, which is vital since the star within the sunken ship combines another iteration of this puzzle with a platforming challenge at the very end. Alternatively, you can also swim to the star before the ship drains. If you've mastered the game's swimming mechanics, that is. This star is one of those change the level layout types, because after the player collects it, future renditions of the map will include a now floating pirate ship, with the bottom of the bay now having been cleared of all the debris. This change allows the player to seek out the rest of Jolly Roger Bay's stars, 2 of which are now at the bottom of the bay. The first of these is attached to the end of a giant eel's tail, which the player will have to chase after with some advanced swimming techniques. Or you could just wait at the entrance, like I did. Perhaps there should have been more to this bit, but at the very least, I can say with certainty that new players who haven't mastered this game's swimming mechanics will likely have some trouble getting this one, even if it's something that returning players can easily cheese. The second star at the bottom of this chasm sits within a strong current. This is a fantastically designed star, because unlike with the eel, it not only challenges new players, but also more advanced ones. There are two solutions to acquiring this star, the first of which is to simply wait until the player unlocks Metal Cap Mario, who can sink to the bottom of the lake and ignore the current's flow. The second solution, however, is to simply utilize one's mastery of the game's swimming mechanics in order to move against the current and acquire the star. With several perfectly timed breaststrokes, it's entirely possible, so this star rewards players who invest the time and effort into mastering the game's underwater mechanics, while also providing an alternative solution to those who can't pull it off. They just have to wait until much later in the game and remember to come back for this one. The red coin star also requires the player to unflood the pirate ship first, since he'll need to platform off the top deck of the ship in order to reach 3 of the coins. There's a tricky jump leading up to the helm of the ship, which the player can triple jump or somersault onto, but the constant rocking of the ship coupled with the hazardous moving crate will add some much needed challenge to the ordeal. Another 4 coins are sitting at the bottom of the bay, waiting for the player to nab up, but the 8th one actually has a rather important game design purpose to it. It sits atop this stone pillar clear as day, which naturally the player will try to scale, and upon doing so, discover that he can climb up these pillars like the trees from earlier levels. This is a vital lesson to impart, not only in broadening the player's idea of what can and can't be climbed in the game, but also in helping him find the level's final star. It sits upon this secret ledge, way high up in the level geometry, but there are some 3 stone pillars right next to it that the player can shoot himself onto using the map's one and only cannon. Between this and the level's 100 coin star, that's it for Jolly Roger Bay. There really isn't any bullshit to this level. It's a perfectly well-designed first go at 3D Mario's water levels, and besides maybe the Unagi Tail star, each and every one of these objectives are unique and challenging in one way or another. The 4th course, Cool Cool Mountain, takes an interesting approach to its design by starting the player at the top of the level's central mountain, rather than at the bottom as was the case with the first 2 courses. At first glance, this might make one think that the level would be easier than the previous ones, but there are a few key elements to this course which actually make it more of a challenge than its predecessors. First off, the mountain itself is completely surrounded by endless drops and bottomless pits. One wrong jump on the player's part can easily mean instant death. Of course, that won't be a problem as long as the player navigates his way down the mountain on foot, but the slippery nature of the level's icy slopes turns these pathways into giant slides, which the player will have to carefully navigate. Speaking of slides, this level's very first star lies at the end of a giant indoor slide that leads down the mountain, which is an even more treacherous challenge for the player to navigate through than the mountain's slopes are. While jumping is completely de-emphasized in this context, the sharp turns and ramps combined with a new set of physics for the player to learn will certainly provide a challenge for first-time players. But the devs were merciful enough to spawn the player in right next to the indoor slide's entrance upon the level's start, so he's free to try this section over and over again until he can finally manage to get to the finish line. This is a vital process for the player to go through, because not only do these slide sections reappear in some future level designs, but Cool Cool Mountain will also challenge the player to master this slide in particular by offering a second star. Upon beating the slide the first time and returning to the level, a penguin will be waiting in the cottage in order to challenge Mario to a race. Defeating him, like with Koopa the Quick, will net the player a second star, which is a brilliant way to reward players not simply for overcoming the level design, but for mastering it. The 3rd star requires that the player find a baby penguin and bring it to its mama. And when I say find a baby penguin, I really mean grab the baby penguin who's literally at the start of the level. The challenge of this star, though, isn't actually in the act of finding the baby so much as it is getting the penguin down the mountain while holding it in Mario's arms, because holding the penguin will slightly limit Mario's movement. He can't dive in this state, nor can he grab onto ledges without first dropping the baby, so the player will need to exhibit some caution while carrying out this task. Does this make the task any less fun? Not at all, because while yes, you could choose to carefully and slowly bring the baby down the side of the mountain, it is also entirely possible to quickly pull the mission off by risking it all and performing some advanced slides and jumps down the mountainside instead. This is a very creative way of getting the player to scale down the mountain with some limitations, but it also doesn't bog the gameplay down by completely killing the player's ability to find solutions for himself either. The red coins are another well-designed way of getting the player to explore the mountain. They're spread all over the place, with the exception of the indoor slide, so the best way of finding them all is to go down the icy slope and comb over the level design along the way. The star after this one, though, is unfortunately a bit less well thought out. All it requires is guiding a snowball down a tiny portion of the mountain, and then speaking to the snowman it creates afterwards. There's zero challenge to this task, but that would be entirely forgivable if it weren't for how late this star shows up. For some reason, the snowball only appears after collecting the first 3 stars, which is an oddly linear design choice for what is otherwise one of the most open-ended video games I've ever played. Maybe this was a mistake, but either way, I don't understand why this level's simplest star requires completing 3 of its most difficult ones first. The last star on Cool Cool Mountain is perhaps the most interesting one, titled Wall Kicks Will Work. To get to it, the player needs to unlock the cannon and shoot himself to a secret part of the map, where a series of signs will tip the player off as to what he needs to do in order to succeed. These signs will remind the player of 2 of the game's most advanced techniques, the long jump and the wall kick. There's a huge gap for the player to clear using the first of these techniques, and ahead of that comes a brilliantly designed tutorial area for teaching the player the wall kick. First, let me explain what a wall kick is. If you've ever heard of a wall jump before, usually in the context of future Mario games, it's essentially the exact same principle, except with much more demanding timing. You need to jump onto a wall, then hit the A button as soon as you land on it. The timing doesn't need to be frame perfect or anything like that, but it does require quick action nonetheless, since Mario can only stay planted on the wall for half a second at most. Successfully pulling the move off will allow Mario to gain some height and distance. This action can also be chained, should there be a second wall nearby, which theoretically could allow Mario to reach indefinite heights. Here, though, the level designers are keeping the task simple, so that the player has time to learn the mechanic. There's a heart at the beginning of these slopes which can indefinitely heal Mario, and it's placed at just the right spot for the player to fall right next to should he fail the course's second wall kick. Speaking of, the first wall kick the course demands of the player is a simple one. You just need to jump on the wall and pull off a kick without a hitch. Simple, but the second one is incredibly demanding by comparison, requiring that the player line up a triple jump in order to get enough height to reach the wall, then pull off the wall kick itself onto an icy and thin platform waiting at the top. The player is expected to fall a lot here, which is why the heart at the beginning was so generously provided. But for as forgiving as this section may seem, it's here for a deliberate reason, to prepare the player for the many, much more advanced iterations of this concept in future level designs. If he learns this now, it will be a great help going into the future, and this tutorial area does an incredible job at giving the player the time, tools, and challenges necessary to effectively learn the mechanic. In its totality, Cool Cool Mountain serves as one of the most well-designed courses in the game, introducing advanced and stable concepts alike with such great finesse that the player should feel entirely prepared once he encounters these challenges yet again in future level designs. Once the player has collected 8 stars from any of these first 4 courses, or perhaps even from some of the castle's secret stars, he can finally challenge Bowser in his first hideout, the Dark World. These Bowser stages are some of my absolute favorites in the game, and that's because they offer an entirely different challenge from the normal courses. Each one is a short, intense burst of well-designed platforming challenges, but they aren't completely disconnected from the previous level designs either, since they pull in the majority of their assets and concepts from the game's main courses. There's only 1 star to collect for each of these courses as well, further emphasizing their linear challenge. The first one is quite the hell march for first-time players, even if you're like me and meticulously completed the first 4 levels before tackling it. The paths here are straightforward and wrought with bottomless pits and hazards. Flamethrowers are introduced early on, and if Mario gets caught in one, it will burn his bum so bad that he runs full speed in pain to get away from the fire, which can easily lead to him falling off the ledge of any of these thin linear paths. Rotating platforms also produce a difficult platforming challenge. Following that is a spiraling ramp full of electric amps, who are unique as enemies since they can't be killed. They must be avoided instead. They move in set patterns though, and won't pursue the player, so they act more like traps than anything else. After this section, a series of moving platforms like the ones introduced at the beginning will have to be navigated past, only for the player to be presented with perhaps the level's greatest challenge of all, a series of seesaw platforms which oversee a bottomless pit. One wrong jump and the player will die, and have to start the level all over again. Luckily, this challenge doesn't come out of nowhere. If you remember, Bob-omb Battlefield introduced this concept early on, so hopefully the player has gotten a feel for the physics of these things and can use that practice to try and manipulate them for himself. You have to use Mario's weight to raise the platforms and create your own path forward, and there are several goodies lining the area that motivate further exploration, should the player be willing to risk all of his progress for the sake of them. Like I did in this footage. Clearly that didn't work out for me. But this is a brilliant risk-reward system and is emblematic of some of the very best designs these Bowser levels have. A brilliant mix of linear challenges and optional tangents like this one, which will reward more exploratory players with 1-ups and red coins. At the very end of this level lies the first boss fight with Bowser. As I alluded to earlier, he pulls the whole tell the player the boss's weakness sin that I so vehemently hate. But the fight is at least a little more complicated than the ones with King's Bob-omb or Whomp, because the player can only defeat Bowser by throwing him into one of the surrounding bombs, which can be done by spinning the analog stick and letting go of Bowser at just the right time. Why are there a bunch of bombs surrounding this floating platform suspended in God knows where? Don't you ever ask these questions. For as much as I love Super Mario 64, I can't help but feel like many of these level designs are completely nonsensical at times, and these Bowser fights are definitely one of the worst offenders in that regard. Regardless, the fight itself is rather short yet inoffensive, and completing it will grant the player the key to the castle's basement, unlocking the next 5 levels of the game. The 5th course, Big Boo's Haunt, is definitely the most unique level in all of Super Mario 64, and that much is clear straight from the get-go. The level consists of nothing but a simple, dimly lit mansion filled with ghosts and possessed books. The music is unique, and in stark contrast to every other track in the game, creates a sense of dread and terror. The level can afford to be this atmospheric though, because its design is much less about platforming than it is about exploration. The very first star does a great job at establishing this, by demanding that the player hunt down the boos hiding in the mansion. There are no crazy jumps to pull off here, nor any insane feats of mechanical prowess. You just need to explore the mansion and kill all the boos. This will not only condition the player for the exploration-based level design of Big Boo's Haunt, but will also help him preliminarily map out some of the mansion before tackling the next 6 stars. Speaking of which, the 2nd star requires that the player find a merry-go-round in the basement, and fight several boos all in a row. This star is kinda similar to the last, but with a greater emphasis on a single challenge room, rather than a large-scale hunt for enemies. The 3rd star will lean further into this exploratory nature of the mansion though. It requires that the player solve a small puzzle involving a bookshelf, in order to open a hidden passageway that leads to the star. Alternatively, a skilled player can pull off some crazy jumps from an adjacent balcony to skip the puzzle altogether, which gives some semblance of player choice in how one wishes to tackle this task. Personally, I prefer the platforming challenge over the rather rudimentary design of the bookshelf puzzle. It only requires hitting 3 books in the right order, which, as you can imagine, is easily solvable through some trial and error. The jump, on the other hand, is genuinely challenging and rewarding to pull off, since it can be quicker too. The 4th star requires gathering the red coins, which are spread throughout the mansion in some pretty clever places. One is hidden behind a possessed piano, and another 2 sit underneath possessed coffins that will attempt to squash the player as he approaches them. The locations themselves lean into the horror environment and open-ended level design extremely well, making this one of the better designed red coin stars in the entire game. The last 2 stars are both hidden on the 3rd floor, which is impossible for the player to reach without pulling off an incredibly difficult wall kick. Yeah, the wall kick we just learned at the end of the 4th course is returning already, and if the player wants these last 2 stars, he's going to need to pull it off yet again, but in a much harder context this time, since the space he has to work with here is so small, and the player will need to perform a double or triple jump in order to gain enough height for the kick itself, then dive at just the right time to make it up the platform leading to the attic. It's easily one of the hardest and most memorable jumps in the entire first half of the game, and it leads to the course's final 2 stars, the first of which is acquired by fighting a big boo on the outside balcony. The star then appears on the roof of the mansion, and this is where I get to give you the first specific example of the camera being complete shit in this game. In order to get the star, the player has to long jump onto a roof, quickly run up it to reach a flat spot at the top, then do the exact same thing for another part of the roof before running down to the final roof and acquiring the star. Unfortunately, there's no way of knowing how to do all that because the player is completely blind for this jump. The camera cannot be moved at all when on the top of the roof, and the fixed camera angle is so terrible that it becomes legitimately impossible to see where you're jumping. Sheer luck and patience is required for this section. I have no idea what the level designer was going for here, but this camera simply does not work for this type of platforming, and the level should have been designed around that and just cut this last jump out entirely. The last star is also on the 3rd floor, but it requires a vanish cap to get to, and there are no blue blocks on the 3rd floor with which to distribute them. So the player will be forced to get one from the 2nd floor instead, and master the wall kick in such a way that he can quickly get to the 3rd floor and hop through the boo painting before the power-up wears off. This requires excellent timing and mastery of this one jump in order to pull off, making the acquisition of this final star one of the most satisfying in the entire game. Big Boo's Haunt is certainly an oddball within this game's lineup of 15 courses, but that's mostly in a good way. The exploration-based level layout is complemented well by smart star placement, and the last 2 stars change up the pace by demanding well-executed advanced jumps in order to reach. It may have one glaring camera issue that ruins the platforming challenge presented by the level's 5th star, but other than that one hiccup, Big Boo's Haunt manages to stand out amongst its peers as one of the most memorable and intriguing level designs in all of Super Mario 64. The next course, Hazy Maze Cave, also takes a more exploration-focused approach to its design, though there are a good deal of platforming challenges for the player to tackle as well. The level starts by immediately presenting 2 diverging paths to the player, the left of which requires that the player pull off a successful long jump in order to clear, and the right of which is filled with pits and flamethrowers to avoid. Both of these paths loop around to a large central room filled with the level's 8 red coins. The challenge here is to carefully ascend using elevators and moving platforms and finding the red coins along the way, all without falling off. This is definitely the most mileage any single level manages to get out of its red coin star, presenting difficult platforming challenges that are to be coupled with exploration and careful navigation. This room is also connected to every other part of the course, including a maze filled with poisonous gas. There are 2 stars for the player to find here, both of which are hidden behind doors found within the maze. One of these stars is just sitting at the top of an elevator, while the other one challenges the player with a set of monkey bars to navigate. I consider this to be a repeat star, because the challenge inherent in finding both of these stars is in finding the doors hidden in a deadly maze filled with poisonous gas. The elevator and these monkey bars do nothing to add to that challenge, unfortunately, so I feel as though one of these stars should have been scrapped and relocated elsewhere. But that's really the only complaint I have with this course. The other 3 stars are hidden in another section of the level entirely, the first of which requires that the player pull off 2 or 3 consecutive wall kicks to reach, demanding that the player master this technique just a bit more than from the last level. The last 2 stars are hidden in an underground lake, which notably has a Lapras swimming around in it. At least that's how I describe this creature. The game just calls her Dory. Dory can be climbed on and controlled simply by looking in the direction that the player wants her to move in. It's a simple courtesy, but I appreciate that the devs designed all the animals in this game to be controlled by the player, rather than having them move in some circular pattern. It grants the player full control and avoids excessive wait time. In Dory's case in particular, the player can also ground pound on her back to get her to lower her head, allowing the player to climb on and use her as a raised platform to jump from. There's an island in the middle of the lake with a star on it that requires the player to do just that, and another platform that leads to the hidden metal cap stage that contains its own secret star. Speaking of the metal cap, the final star in Hazy Maze Cave requires using the metal cap to sink to the bottom of the lake, and use Mario's weight to trigger a purple switch, opening the way to the star. Here, the player will have to perform 2 consecutive long jumps in order to clear a set of gaps, and nab the final star. In its totality, Hazy Maze Cave serves as a wonderful exploration-based course filled with platforming and navigation-based challenges. It certainly feels like one of the game's most complete and fully fleshed out levels, upping the challenge from previous courses while also introducing new ones, with the only arguable flaw being a single repeat star location. The next course, Lethal Lava Land, takes a sharp turn in terms of aesthetics and level design both. The entirety of the level layout is covered with lava, and falling in said lava will make Mario jump high in the air in pain and lose a third of his health. To complement that threat, this level is entirely platforming based, with drawbridges, moving platforms, physics puzzles, and sinking floors to navigate through. On top of those threats, the main enemy of this level is a new foe called the Bully, who will charge at the player and knock him back, in an attempt to force him to fall into the lava. The player will have to respond by pushing back, since the only way to kill a bully is by forcing it into the lava. The course introduces this new enemy right at the beginning, placing one right at the start of the branching paths that lead further into lethal lava land. The importance of this enemy's placement at the beginning of the stage is paramount to the overall level design, since 2 of the course's stars involve fighting bigger versions of this same foe. As such, the developers are seeking to teach the player how to fight the level's bosses by first providing smaller yet similar challenges for the player to overcome before reaching these later ones. That being said, while I do believe this is great level design and that the later big bully boss fight is decent, there really was no need to have 2 of them, especially since they take place practically right next to each other. The devs tried to make the second fight harder by forcing the player to fight 3 smaller bullies before the fight with the big one. But as I've said in previous videos of mine, spamming several easy enemies for the player to kill doesn't make your game harder, it just makes it longer. It would have been better if the devs simply created a harder version of this first fight. Instead, maybe making the bully faster, or heavier, or maybe even take more than 1 hit to kill, leaving an explosion in his wake. Just something more than the exact same fight from before. This isn't the only poorly designed star in Lethal Lava Land either. The red coin star requires that the player collect 8 red coins that sit on the shifting puzzle of Bowser. That's it. You can just collect the 8 coins and get the star. I assume that the challenge of the star was to avoid being dropped into the lava by a shifting piece of the puzzle, but that's not very hard considering that the floor moves 1 tile at a time, and you'll never be knocked off so long as you just aren't adjacent to an open section of the puzzle. And even if you are, there's still a high probability that you're not on the specific piece of the floor that's going to shift, so the chances of being dropped into the lava are pretty low. And even if you do get dropped in the lava, you'll still have 2/3 of your health left, which is instantly recovered upon grabbing another red coin. So, all in all, this is way too easy of a star to collect. Granted, I don't think the concept here is bad, it's just underdeveloped. Perhaps there could have been only 4 coins to collect here, with the other 4 being spread across an even faster moving version of this puzzle, with several tiles moving all at once. In that scenario, we would have a star that introduced a slight challenge, then followed up on it with an even harder version of the same task, i.e. we would have some incremental difficulty here. As it stands, this is definitely the worst red coin star in the game. The 4th star is a lot more interesting though. It introduces a physics puzzle involving a wooden log. The player needs to run on it like a hamster wheel, making the log roll towards a platform that would otherwise be inaccessible for the player to reach on his own. In addition to these 4 more obvious stars, there are also a final 2 which lie hidden within a hidden section of the level, which the player can enter by jumping into the volcano at the center of the map. In here lies 2 separate platforming challenges. The first of these requires that the player ascend a spiraling ramp up to the top of the volcano. Along the way, bullies, traps, platforming challenges, and thin walkways will impede the player's progress, and attempt to knock the player off his path and into the lava. Not only does this star location serve as a wonderful set of platforming challenges on its own, but it also serves to prepare the player for increasingly difficult level designs that will appear later in the game. The same can also be said for the final star of this course, which is also located in the volcano. It requires that the player follow a set of elevators that ascend up the volcano, and jump off both of them before their paths end and they fall into the lava below. Next, the player will need to ascend some poles while also avoiding being burned by a nearby flamethrower. And finally, the star will sit at the end of a set of incredibly small platforms for the player to jump through. These 2 volcano stars lie within one of the most airtight, well-designed sections of the game's many courses. And even if some of the other stars weren't perfect, the main section of Lethal Lava Land itself is host to some great level designs of its own, presenting a great variety of platforming challenges while deftly introducing several new mechanics that will be built upon in future courses. Speaking of which, the 8th course, Shifting Sandland, is in many ways a continuation of the previous course's type of level design. There's a large open area with platforming challenges galore, a new deadly terrain to deal with, and a large hidden section of the level housing several stars within it. But there are a few key differences between these levels that differentiate Shifting Sandland from its predecessor. For one, there are several wing caps available throughout the stage, which encourage the player to use flight to acquire several of the level's stars, including the very first one. There's a giant condor flying in the air which holds the star, and the player will need to fly into him in order to get him to drop it. Beyond that, the red coin star also requires flight, given that 4 of the course's red coins are floating high in the air, with no way to reach them other than through flight. But while these first 2 stars are all well and good and utilize the wing cap power up rather well, a problem begins to emerge with Shifting Sandland's overall level design due to the inclusion of the wing cap. You see, there are several platforming challenges in this course that the player can completely skip over with the wing cap, trivializing whole sections of the level design. Granted, any course involving the wing cap could have this accusation levied against it, including Lethal Lava Land, which also housed a hidden wing cap block for the player to discover. The key difference with Shifting Sandland, however, is in its poor design. You see, previous courses that included the wing cap would also stumble into the potential issue of players completely skipping over whole sections of the level, but there was one big motivating factor that would prevent this from becoming a major problem. Coins. As I've said previously, every course in this game has a 100 coin star to collect, and these are always the most challenging to obtain, since they essentially require full mastery and knowledge of the level's challenges and secrets in order to complete. Levels with the wing cap would, therefore, encourage the player to explore the entire level and engage with its challenges by spreading coins all throughout it. Take Lethal Lava Land, for example. Sure, players could use the wing cap to fly over the many challenges of the level and skip straight to the stars, but doing so would also mean skipping over the many coins spread throughout these platforming challenges. That means that if you want that 100 coin star, you're going to need to put down the cap and engage with the level design. This allows the player to keep his sense of freedom, since after all, these 100 coin stars are optional, but it also grants players a reward for actually engaging in the design and challenges of these levels, and ensures that more hardcore players, who probably want to collect all 120 stars, are presented with a suitable challenge. This is risk-reward type game design at its best. Sure, it's easier and less dangerous to use the cap, but it's also less rewarding as a result. Conversely, there's more danger involved in collecting the level's coins on foot, so the reward for doing so is made to be great as a result. Shifting Sandland does not do this. There's a whole section of this level involving a bunch of tox boxes that constantly roam these thin walkways that they inhabit, and one wrong step means falling into the sand below and suffering an instant death. This section is creative and challenging, and yet there's literally no reason to navigate through it. The red coin located here lies off the path these things roam on, so flying straight to it is a piece of cake. And guess what? That's the only reward waiting here for the player. So that leaves zero motivation for the player to navigate through this part of the level design. It might as well simply not exist at all. After all, what's the point of taking an extra risk when there isn't any reward associated with it? The wing cap also completely trivializes the star at the top of the pyramid, which would otherwise have been one of the highlights of the level. Without the wing cap, you'd need to actually make your way to the pyramid through the level itself, then ascend up an increasingly narrower set of platforms to reach the top. One wrong move and you could potentially fall right into the quicksand and die. Alternatively, an advanced and well-timed triple jump could get you enough air to reach the star, but this is an insanely difficult move to pull off, so either way, the player is presented with a major challenge followed by an appropriate reward. That's how this star would be without the wing cap. With it, acquiring the star at the top of the pyramid becomes as simple as flying straight to it. And to make things worse, the player will already know where to get a wing cap because the first star literally requires using it. Oh, and as if the devs couldn't have made it any easier, there's a wing cap block sitting right at the base of the pyramid as well, almost as if they're inviting you to skip over their own level design. Speaking of the pyramid, it continues in the tradition of the previous course by providing a more linear set of platforming challenges that lead up to several stars. The level design itself is actually quite good. There are thwomps of several shapes and attack patterns who will block the way, and shifting platforms and steep jumps that challenge the player's mechanical skills. This is where the vast majority of the level's coins are too, so the player has motivation for exploring the entirety of the pyramid, even with the potential skips he can pull off in here. Two of the star locations here are pretty straightforward. The first is at the very top of the pyramid, while the other requires collecting 5 specific coins leading down a sandslide. The last one, though, is a bit of an oddball. The player has to stand on 4 pillars surrounding the pyramid in order to blow up the pyramid's capstone, allowing Mario to drop in from the top and take an elevator down to a secret boss fight. If it weren't for the fact that this star is literally called Stand Tall on the 4 Pillars, then it would be impossible to figure out because it's completely unintuitive and comes out of nowhere. The boss fight itself is pretty bad. A possessed statue named Irok will straight up tell you to fight him, quote, hand to hand, which is his not so subtle way of telling the player that his weakness is in his hands, or rather the eyes within the palms of his hands. All the player needs to do is hit the Irok's hands over and over again until he dies, and then the star is his. A fittingly disappointing end to a sadly disappointing course. I don't even know why the devs even bothered designing a level at this point. The boss fight is terrible, as always, but it's also incredibly strange to me just how completely trivialized half this course's stars are because of a single power-up. I swear, this is the only level in the whole game that completely mismanages the wing cap. All the other ones actually manage to balance it somehow, so I really don't know what went wrong with this one. My best guess is that this was one of the levels that the team rushed to get out the door at the end of development, and someone added in a wing cap partway through without adjusting the level design to accommodate it. Regardless of the reasons though, the result was one of this game's most ill-designed levels. Luckily, the foul taste of sand that Course 8 may have left in the player's mouth will be immediately cleansed by this game's second Bowser level. Before entering it, the player needs to have collected 30 stars and obtained the first star from Course 9. Dire Docks. This is a bit of an odd requirement, but it's luckily not as obtuse to figure out as it may sound, because the entrance to Dire Docks will appear in front of the Bowser stage itself, easily communicating to the player that they need to enter that course first. The story reason for this has to do with Bowser's submarine, and yes, he has one of those apparently, being docked in Dire Docks, and somehow Mario collecting the Power Star sitting on the top of it forces Bowser to wait for Mario in a sea of fire instead. I don't think I need to tell you this, but this game's story makes zero sense. Ignoring the poorly written plot for a moment though, Bowser in the Fire Sea is one of this game's most well-designed platforming gauntlets, just as all the Bowser levels are. It builds off of many of the assets and design choices we saw appear in Lethal Lava Land, the most obvious of which is the abundance of lava surrounding each and every platform in the level. On the one hand, this makes failure in this level a little more forgiving than in the previous Bowser stage, since lava doesn't instantly kill Mario the way a bottomless pit does. But this is balanced by both the increased length of the level, as well as the wider variety of challenges and traps that utilize the lava to their advantage. It starts off by reintroducing the sinking platforms from Lethal Lava Land, with 3 in a row creating a small bridge for the player to cross. The rising lava leaves very little room for the player to safely stand on, so this either requires quick jumps or careful platforming in order to pass through without getting burned. Afterwards, a new level element is introduced, a sinking pole. Like most poles, the player can jump on this, then jump off to increase his height, but the sinking nature of it means that the player needs to be careful not to jump off too soon, lest the decrease in Mario's height make him fall straight into the lava. These 2 level elements are small and harmless on their own, but they're introduced early on to prepare the player for the level's final gauntlet at the end, which adds several more platforms, 2 flamethrowers, and an amp to the mix. With this, quick movement can only get the player so far, but overly careful platforming could also prove fatal due to the rather proactive threats that the flames and amps present. Thus, the player must quickly yet cautiously navigate through this section, putting the player's mechanical skills to the test. This section is then followed up by a labyrinth of sinking poles, building off their earlier introduction in this level. The player has 2 options here. Strategically use each pole to ascend and descend through the maze before jumping off at just the right time, or use the wall kick to ascend up the labyrinth and skip over it. It's a creative little challenge that rewards the player for his timing skills, whether that be by wall kicking or jumping off each pole at just the right time. Getting past this section leads to the end of the course, where we encounter Bowser for his second boss fight of the game. This fight manages to up the ante from our previous encounter with Bowser by introducing an all-new element for the player to manage: the terrain. At the start of the fight, Bowser will jump high into the air and slam down on the ground, which will cause it to tilt to an almost 90-degree angle. The player will then have to keep Mario from sliding into the lava below, but he can also use this to his advantage by getting Mario to land just behind Bowser, allowing him to quickly grab the Koopa's tail. The fight from here is sadly the same as before, just toss Bowser into a bomb and you'll instantly win the fight. This is still a pretty weak boss encounter, but the inclusion of a dynamic terrain certainly adds at least a bit of depth when compared to this game's previous boss battles. Once again, Bowser's defeat will grant the player yet another key, one that will open the castle's second and third floors, finally allowing the player to tackle all of this game's courses in any order that he pleases.
Before moving on to the later courses, however, let's first talk about the 9th course, Dire Dire Docks. As I mentioned earlier, this level's first star lies atop Bowser's submarine, which disappears after the player beats Bowser in the Fire Sea. In its place is a huge network of poles descending from the ceiling, with the level's red coins spread throughout them. If the player wants those coins, he'll have to navigate Mario from pole to pole, carefully timing each jump and adjusting Mario's position in order to collect coins at varying elevations. This is perhaps the best designed red coin mission in the entire game, challenging players using previously established mechanics in a brand new way. There are 2 other stars in this little dock area to nab up as well, both of which sit at the bottom of the bay. One of these sits behind a set of thin bars, requiring that the player combine a metal cap with a vanish cap in order to obtain. The other sits at the center of a rising current, which will only appear if the player swims through the rings of water that emit from said current. From there, the metal cap will easily allow the player to sink to the bottom and nab up the star. Neither of these star locations are super creative or well designed, especially since this is the one and only time that the game will demand that the player combine 2 caps, but they're at least decent, if nothing else. The final 2 stars are located near the beginning of the level, at the bottom of a giant crater lake. One of these requires that the player swim through 5 rings of water that emit behind a manta ray. As you might notice, this is practically the same task as before. Granted, most players are likely to do this one first, since it's closer to the start of the level, and the moving nature of the manta ray does add some variety at least, but it's still a repeat star challenge all the same, which is pretty lazy. The last star, by contrast, is much more creative. It requires solving a chest puzzle like the ones we saw back in Jolly Roger Bay, while simultaneously avoiding being sucked up in a whirlpool sitting at the center of the lake. This can be rather difficult because the whirlpool is quite strong, and the final chest is rather close to it. The only way to acquire the star while avoiding being sucked in is by mastering the breaststroke, and pulling it off perfectly right before the whirlpool has a chance to suck Mario in. In its totality, Dire Dire Docks serves as a wonderful evolution of this game's water levels, following up Jolly Roger Bay by evolving its mechanics and adding in new concepts from subsequent level designs. Not every star is perfect, but the ones that hit really do make a huge impact, making this one of the most memorable levels from the entire game. It's unfortunate then that I have to talk about Course 10 next, because it begins to set a worrying trend for the last 5 levels of the game with its rather poor design. Snowman's Land, as the 10th course is called, is perhaps the smallest level in the game. It centers around a giant snowman with some surrounding terrain to explore, and a smaller secret area in the form of an igloo. You'd think that with such a small course for the devs to model, that this would result in a higher concentration of good level design and some well-placed stars. That is not the case. Snowman's Land is one of this game's most disappointing courses. Right off the bat, it hits the player with the laziest star in the entire game. Real quick, to illustrate my point, I'm going to show you the entire footage of me collecting this star from the moment I enter the level until I grab it. That's all it took. Just run left and enter an icy maze. Clearly, I'm being very generous with that term. This is the worst star in the entire game. It just screams lazy, almost as if the devs were rushing to get the final levels out the door, which they were. Super Mario 64 was meant to have, according to Miyamoto, 32 or maybe even 40 courses by the end of development. This game only has 15. It's very clear when reading many of the developer interviews for this game that several levels were just thrown together, and that's an actual quote from Miyamoto himself. It really shows in Snowman's Land in particular, but sadly, it's a trend we'll continue to see going forward. The other stars in this course don't fare much better, I'm afraid. One of them literally copy and pastes content from Lethal Lava Land by forcing the player to fight another big bully over a lake of what is essentially just blue lava. I wish that was a joke, but it's not. The big bully and the lava are just painted blue, and it's exactly the same fight as the two we saw back in Course 7. Then we have the star that sits at the top of the snowman's head, which would have been a fine location if it weren't for just how utterly broken the level design is on this thing. The paths are cruelly thin, and some of the level geometry is just straight up broken. I mean, look at this shit. In addition to that, we also have my favorite mechanic in any video game, waiting. To reach the top of the snowman, the player needs to get past his icy breath, which can only be done by waiting behind this stupid penguin as he walks across an incredibly thin icy bridge. Not only does the player need to wait for the penguin to return to the start of the bridge before being able to cross, but this stupid flightless bird doesn't even bother to walk like a normal human being. Or penguin, for that matter. He walks in varying intervals of fast and slow speeds, then backs up at times for no reason other than to make this section harder. The only skill this type of gameplay tests is the player's patience, because holy fucking shit, is there nothing worse than getting blown off this stupid mountain, picking up Mario's hat, and hearing him say, "Here we go!" for the 15th time. The last 3 stars don't fare much better either. One of them is hidden in an alcove right next to a frozen lake, and the only way to reach it is by jumping on the head of this very specific spindrift. And I mean that. There's no other way to ascend this gap and make it to the star other than to bounce off this one enemy's head. That means if you fuck up even once, you'll have to exit the level and waddle your ass all the way back to the painting, or just kill yourself to start over again. There is a second spindrift here that might make you think you actually have 2 chances to do this, but unfortunately, it's bugged. As you can see in this footage, the first spindrift is swimming with its head poking slightly above the water, allowing Mario to jump right on top of it. The second one, however, is just a tad lower, so jumping on his head will cause Mario to fall in the water before jumping off of his head, completely killing his momentum and preventing the player from reaching the alcove above. This is straight up broken level design, and further supports my belief that this was one of the last levels the team managed to slap together before pushing the game out the door. What further exacerbates this problem is the fact that the player needs to pull off this maneuver not once, but twice, since half of the level's red coins are also up here. The final star is then located in the igloo that I mentioned earlier. It's sort of designed like a maze, but the goal is to find a vanish cap at the end and use that to pass through the icy walls that house coins, 1-ups, and the star. Unfortunately, for as decent as this star location is, the actual maze itself was clearly never playtested, because it's entirely possible for the player to get stuck in several parts of the maze after the vanish cap wears off, forcing a restart. Take this room with the red Bob-omb in it, for example. The player will naturally be drawn to it since the Bob-omb sticks out like a sore thumb, but if the player takes too long getting to it, or too long talking to the Bob-omb, or tries opening the 2 boxes that are also in the room, then the vanish cap will wear off and the player will be completely unable to exit. The only solution is to then exit the level and waddle your ass all the way back to the painting, and enter the level again. This is garbage game design and could have easily been solved by putting a second blue block in this room that could allow the player to exit should the vanish cap wear off. There's no point in being unnecessarily cruel to the player like this. This is probably the result of poor planning due to a lack of time, as I previously theorized, but perhaps it's possible that one of the disgruntled Super Mario Bros. 2 developers got their hands on this course and managed to riddle it with stupid NES-era horseshit. Either way, Snowman's Land managed to stand out as one of Super Mario 64's worst levels, filling its very limited space with badly placed stars and broken level geometry. I wish I could say that this type of broken level design ends here, but unfortunately, I can't, because the majority of courses going forward will also suffer from many of the same problems that we see in Snowman's Land. The first of these later courses is Wet Dry World, and while it isn't nearly as terrible as Snowman's Land, it does, unfortunately, suffer from one major flaw: the camera. I brought up most of my issues with this game's camera earlier in the video, and I also mentioned that it's mostly a situational thing. Some levels like Bob-omb Battlefield have very few flaws with the camera, whereas Big Boo's Haunt has this shitty roof section where the camera is fixed and the player has zero way of viewing where he needs to jump. Wet Dry World is like Big Boo's Haunt, except that the floor is the roof, and the platforming sections are the roof, and the water's the roof, and sometimes Mario is the roof too. For some fucked up reason, the player is completely barred from being able to move the camera 360 degrees, making it impossible for him to view Mario from behind or swing the camera around naturally. This issue is annoying throughout most of the level, but it's downright horrendous when trying to collect the first star in particular. This one sits at the top of the level and has many platforming challenges leading up to it, but the final stretch is where the camera really fucks the player up, since the thin walkways leading to it are an absolute hellfuck to walk over when the player can't adjust the camera the way he wants to. It would be so easy if the game just let you put the camera behind Mario, but it just doesn't, for presumably absolutely zero reason. This has to have been a programming error that simply was never fixed, because I can't for the life of me understand what the devs were thinking here by making the camera this terrible. The rest of Wet Dry World stars are a bit of a mixed bag. Like I said, the star at the top of the level is marred by the terrible camera, but that's not the only example of bad star design. The second one was designed to have a gauntlet of platforming challenges leading straight towards it, which would have been decent if it weren't for the level's main mechanic trivializing the entire process. The gimmick of Wet Dry World revolves around using switches to change the water levels, which is interesting, but it ruins this star because now the player can simply swim to it rather than go through the intricately designed set of platforming challenges that were designed for it. I know I said that the freedom this game grants the player is a great thing, and it usually is, but there is such a thing as too much freedom. There should always be a risk and a reward for the player's decision. There's no risk to swimming to the star though, only a reward. So why would anyone choose to go through the longer set of challenging jumps when you can just swim straight up to the star instead? I know some people might say something like, oh, it's the player's choice whether or not they want to challenge themselves, but it's really not. It's on the game designer to make sure that the player is sufficiently challenged and is unable to completely trivialize the game's design. It is not the player's responsibility to challenge himself. He can, and he might have some more fun that way, but that doesn't excuse the poor design of the original game. When you need the player to put handicaps on himself in order to have fun with your video game, that's when you fail as a game developer. The third star is also a flop, albeit a completely different kind of flop from the last one. It's titled Secrets in the Shallows and Skies, which isn't too helpful a description because these so-called secrets are incredibly vague. 2 pushable blocks and 3 bricks to break. There's nothing weird or suspicious about them, and considering that there are several other blocks and bricks that don't count as secrets, it becomes quite confusing to discern what exactly the pattern is here. This one just ends up being odd. The player doesn't know what to look for, and trial and error is really the only way to figure this one out. It isn't horrendous like the last two, but it's still very weak all the same. The fourth star, however, is actually pretty creative. It's stuck in a cage with some wooden planks underneath it, and stepping on the left one will cause it to sink straight down to the bottom of what is essentially an elevator shaft. The player needs to then race down to the bottom of the shaft and hop onto the wooden plank before it starts ascending back to the top. This is a pretty decent star, all things considered. It's not brilliant, sure, but it's also no travesty. The last 2 stars both sit in a hidden underwater section of the level, accessible only through the use of this level's cannon to shoot Mario straight over a tower of metal bars and into the tunnel entrance. At the end of it lies an underwater city, with red coins scattered throughout it. The twist here is that they're only able to be collected by Mario if he's on land, since they're all hidden inside of big blocks that need to be ground pounded on in order to open. Therefore, the player will need to lower the water level and platform up to these blocks without the ability to cheat by simply swimming instead. This is exactly what was missing from the earlier star I mentioned. Smart design that gates off an easy skip and forces the player to engage with the level design instead. Some of the coins are pretty easy to obtain, requiring simple double jumps or somersaults, but a few of them are downright unforgiving, requiring further mastery and creative use of the wall kick to ascend to the top of the town's tallest buildings. On top of that, the last star requires that the player nab up a vanish cap and race across town to phase through a set of metal bars, then wait for it to wear off and wall jump up to the star's final location. This hidden town and its 2 stars are definitely the best parts of the level, and is the one saving grace that Wet Dry World possesses, because otherwise it comes off as one of the game's most unfinished and untested levels, featuring a broken camera, poorly designed star locations, and a completely imbalanced water mechanic that trivializes several of the level's challenges. The 12th course, Tall Tall Mountain, is also an unfortunate victim of bad star locations and poor camera placement, though not quite to the same extreme as with Wet Dry World, World or Snowman's Land. The level design is much more competent here, for one thing. There's a single mountain for the player to ascend, and a couple different ways to do so that challenges different sets of skills, like somersaulting or long jumping. 2 of these platforming gauntlets hold 4 red coins each, the first of which is a patch of mushrooms that lie over a bottomless pit. The player will have to carefully jump between each one, gathering red coins along the way, without falling to his death. The second red coin challenge involves a series of stepped cliffs that require careful use of the backwards flip or somersaults in order to ascend, due to the extremely small nature of these platforms. Overall, these are decently designed late game red coin challenges, requiring that the player use his accumulated knowledge and skills to navigate and ascend through several dangerous platforming gauntlets. The 2 more secretive stars in this level are also well designed. One requires finding the hidden red Bob-omb to unlock this level's cannon, which itself is also hidden in the cliffside underneath the starting area. The player then needs to shoot Mario straight at a faraway mushroom that holds the star, and since it's all alone in the middle of nowhere, that means that the player only has 1 shot without killing Mario. This is a fair challenge to demand of the player by this point in the game, seeing as how we're close to the end. Combine that with the advanced exploration needed to find and unlock this cannon, and I'd say that this is one of the better stars involving use of the cannon from the entire game. There's another hard to find star in this level, which can only be acquired by first finding a secret slide hidden in the mountainside. This is incredibly difficult to spot, and I wouldn't blame anyone who gave up and couldn't find it. But there are at least some coins sitting near the entrance to the slide that should hopefully draw the player's attention towards the odd-looking wall that the slide is housed behind. This slide is the last of its kind in the entire game, and as you might expect, it's also the hardest to navigate. There's one turn in particular that's quite demanding, because the change in terrain also affects Mario's friction, and can easily throw off players on their first few tries if they've yet to accustom themselves to how Mario controls when sliding on wood. There's also a ramp near the end that requires speed to jump, which will punish players who try overcoming the challenge by going slow and steady up until the end. The devs were also smart enough to make sure that death doesn't start the player back at the base of the mountain, instead putting a checkpoint at the beginning of the slide for players to spawn back into. This allows the player to give this challenge another go over and over again, without being forced to waddle his ass all the way back up the mountain every single time, which would have made the whole ordeal extremely annoying. This is smart game design, and is a wonderful way to give the side sections of Super Mario 64 one final send-off before the end of the game. Unfortunately, this is where the smart design choices of Tall Tall Mountain end, and the laziness begins to take front and center stage. That laziness takes the form of 3 repeat stars, all located in the exact same place. The very first of these stars lies at the top of the mountain, as you would likely come to expect of a vertical stage like this one. The second star requires that you go to the exact same place that you got the first star, and then grab a monkey to get him to give you the star. That's it. No further challenges, no lessons learned. Just the exact same star, but with a monkey to grab. The third and final repeat star is possibly even more laughable. It just sits underneath the platform that held the last 2 stars. I guess they were trying to make this one seem hidden or something, what with the waterfall that they put out in front of it, but that simply doesn't work because the water is completely translucent and does nothing to hide the star at all. What we have then is half of the level stars all located in the exact same spot at the top of the mountain, with virtually 0 variation between them. It's a shame because this level is otherwise quite good, barring some terrible camera angles here and there. But with half of the stars being such blatant repeats, it becomes difficult to walk away from this one with anything but a semblance of disappointment. Still, disappointment is at least a preferable feeling when compared to the emotions that this next course will instill in me. Tiny Huge Island is the absolute worst course in the game. It is straight up not finished and borderline experimental at times. My personal theory is that when the dev team was cutting courses for the final release of the game, they left this one in by accident, because I have no idea how anyone at Nintendo could have thought that this level was good enough to include in the final game. Its main gimmick revolves around warp pipes, which turn the island tiny or huge, with Mario remaining the same size, which essentially creates 2 versions of the same level. On paper, that sounds like a neat concept. In practice, it doesn't fucking work at all. The problem with this mechanic is that the tiny version of the island, where Mario is suddenly huge, is completely fucking broken. Mario's physics are wonky, and he suddenly moves much faster than before, which feels like the exact opposite of what you would expect when controlling what appears to be a larger version of your player character. And the level geometry is way too small for the player to comfortably navigate around, or sometimes to navigate at all. The
This wonkiness with the controls and level layout is then taken to the extreme with this level's new enemy, the tiny Goombas. Just in your head real quick, I want you to imagine what you think is going to happen to Mario when he bumps into one of these things. Got it? Great, let's roll the footage. That is not what you thought was going to happen. So much as touching a single Goomba in this level will fling the player across the goddamn map with such force that it pretty much guarantees that Mario is going to fall off of a ledge wherever this happens. This whole level is completely broken, from the nonsensical physics to the stupid tiny Goombas that are impossible to kill, but what really bogs down Tiny Huge Island above all else are the terrible stars. The first one simply requires killing 5 piranha plants, who are not only incredibly easy to eliminate, but simple to get to, since these plants are literally a couple jumps from the start of the level. The second star is found at the top of the huge island, which is about as good a place that the level designers could have put a star, but the level design is so broken and the physics are so wonky that getting to the top of the island becomes a chore, rather than a way to challenge the player's skill sets, as was the case with the previous courses that put their stars at the end of their levels. The third star involves a rematch with Koopa the Quick, and this is genuinely the one and only good star in the whole level, since Koopa is much faster than before and the race takes place in the non-broken half of the level design. It's much too short though, which highlights just how small even the supposedly huge island truly is. The fourth star also brings us right back to the tiny island, asking that the player find and step on 5 small holes over the course of the level design. This isn't a particularly hard task by itself, given just how little there is to explore on this tiny version of the island, but it does get a bit hard to execute when you combine the tiny Goombas that launch Mario at Mach 10 speeds and the terrible camera angles that make finding anything on this map an absolute chore. The red coin star is the only thing about this level that I can call good without having to add some sort of qualifier at the end. The red coins are all hidden in a room full of bottomless pits and spaced out rocks to platform on, testing the player's ability to long jump, double jump, and wall kick on demand, with little space to work with. Maybe it's the fact that this part of the level is entirely detached from the rest of this travesty of a course, and that there are no wonky tiny island physics to deal with, but this star is actually a well-designed one, testing the player's platforming chops in a fair and well-crafted platforming section that is completely separate from the rest of the level design. The last star is acquired by beating this game's penultimate boss, Wiggler. You might think that with him holding such an important title that this boss fight is going to be quite difficult, or at least very memorable. You would be wrong. Wiggler just sort of walks around and does nothing the whole fight. I presume that touching him causes damage or something, but I cannot confirm this due to the fact that, in all 5 of the playthroughs I experienced in order to make this review, I have yet to be damaged by the Wiggler once. The wiki says that he's supposed to do damage, apparently only 2/3 of the way through the fight for some reason, but like I said, I have yet to experience this for myself. As such a statement might infer, this fight is the absolute worst in the game. All it takes is 3 jumps on the Wiggler's back and he's dead. He also has a tendency to interrupt the fight with mundane dialogue after each and every hit he takes, making this fight not only way too easy, but also quite annoying to get through. Nothing about this is remotely challenging, especially considering the fact that this is one of the last levels in the entire game that we're looking at here. Perhaps Wiggler is, therefore, emblematic of the quality of Tiny Huge Island as a whole. Juvenile, disappointing, and clearly not playtested before release. I think the biggest problem with Tiny Huge Island is that one of the joys of Super Mario 64 is in how Mario controls. As such, most levels in this game serve as playgrounds with which the player can test out Mario's moves and challenge themselves with the well-crafted level design. Even some of the lesser courses, like Snowman's Land, will follow this rule, which at least make them feel complete, even if they're not necessarily good. But Tiny Huge Island fails in this regard by making half of the level take place in an unfinished state, where the physics make zero sense and Mario, the central character and focal point of the player's control over the entire game, is suddenly given a new set of physics to handle within a tiny and unintuitive level design that simply does not accommodate this new type of gameplay. This is Super Mario 64 at its worst, detached from all the great gameplay elements that make the rest of the game feel so great. Luckily, we've hit the end of our streak of bad levels in Super Mario 64 with this next course, Tick-Tock Clock. From what I gathered, this is universally the most despised level from the entire game, because Tick-Tock Clock puts all the player's skills and knowledge about the game's mechanic to the test with one of the most challenging gauntlets of platforming that any 3D Mario game has ever seen. So it's only natural that the most challenging and intricately designed level in the entire game would turn out to be my absolute favorite. After all, I am the masochist who loves the very hardest and most confusing levels in every Zelda game, so long as they're well crafted and designed with care, of course. I'd say that makes me an authority on the subject of tough but fair game design. Though, if you ask some of the commenters from my Zelda 2 review, they'll tell you that I'm also a scrub lord who gives their favorite shitty Zelda game a bad review because I refuse to get good. So, take your pick then. So then, why do I love Tick-Tock Clock where others hate it? First and foremost, we have to address its design, which is entirely different from every other course in the game. There are no open, boundless fields of grass, or snow, or dirt, or a mountain to climb at the center of it all. Instead, the level takes place within the inner workings of an enormous clock, which serves to create a vertical level design unlike anything we see in this game. There are pendulums, block platforms, triangle platforms, rotating platforms, and traps which all operate at the same speed, which is determined by the speed of the clock itself. This speed can be manipulated by the player via entering the clock at different times. Entering the clock when the hand strikes 3, for example, stops movement altogether, which makes several platforming challenges easier and several others near impossible to clear. Likewise, the speed of these rotations can be increased or decreased, and all of this occurs before the player even begins the course. The stars for this level were crafted in a similar way to the design of the course itself. They're rather straightforward, and placed upon the path leading up to the top of the course. None of them require exploration, which complements the linear design of the level quite perfectly. I've seen complaints levied at this level in the past because of this. After all, getting 1 star a third of the way into the level means being booted out and starting the level all over again for the next one, does it not? This is true, but that complaint misses the very essence of Mario's traditional level design. Take World 1-1 from the original Mario Bros., for example. Sure, the player will need to retread the same beginning stage every time he gets a game over, but the stage was never very difficult to begin with. It's only difficult to those who've never played this game before. The purpose of 1-1, beyond simply being a tutorial level, was to provide the player with a simple challenge that, upon being booted back to over and over again, would see the player begin to get better and better at it with each pass. As such, each and every player will go from being entirely inexperienced at the start of the game to blazing through 1-1 in no time, optimizing his run so that he has even more lives and even more knowledge to utilize by the time he makes it back to the level that he keeps dying at. This is the very essence of platform gaming. Level design that makes the player better at the game simply by playing it over time, and giving him opportunities to really see just how far he's come. Super Mario 64 is far too large a game to boot the player back to the very start of after every game over, like with the original NES title. But that spirit of retreading older challenges in order to improve continues with level designs like Tick-Tock Clock, because every time the player reascends the clock tower in order to get to the next star, he'll learn something more about the level layout, and get better and better at making each jump. And that's knowledge the player will need, because each subsequent star manages to up the ante further and further as the level progresses. Speaking of which, let's get to talking about the stars. The first 2 are located right next to each other, about a third of the way up the clock. The first of these is simple to collect. Simply ascend the tower and jump into the cage it's located in. The second one, however, is a bit of a mess, because while it was intended to teach the player how to ride the hour hand of the clock, which would be useful for later on, it is unfortunately ruined by this game's one glaring flaw: the camera. If you enter first-person mode, you can clearly see what the intent of the level designer was when putting the star here. The hour hand clearly creates a bridge to the star, something that's easy to see from this angle, but whomever designed the fixed camera angle for this level apparently didn't get the memo, and locked the camera throughout the whole course, preventing players from spotting this star from where it was intended. Instead, the easiest solution is to simply jump down into the little alcove the star is located in from above, which defeats the entire purpose of even putting a second star here. This is the level's one design flaw, but like I said, it's more of an extension of the earlier issues I brought up with the camera in general, rather than the fault of Tick-Tock Clock itself. The third star is located just a bit further up from the first two, and is protected by a series of pendulums and pits that the player will need to navigate through, building on the challenges these things presented at the very beginning of the level. The fourth star is located further up from here, about 2/3 of the way through the level, and the fifth star is located at the very top of the level. The platforming challenges the player will need to navigate through to get to these 2 stars will vary wildly depending on whether or not the clock is stopped or moving. Stopped means there won't be any moving platforms, which can be helpful for some sections, but it also means the player will have to come up with some creative solutions in order to reach certain places that were intended to be navigated to using the inner workings of the clock. My favorite example of this is with the red coin star. The red coins all lie in a maze of rotating platforms, and collecting all of them can be quite the challenge like this. But by stopping the clock, these rotating platforms will suddenly become still, and allow the player to have a much easier time in collecting the coins than he would have had otherwise. The star at the top of the level does the same thing, but in reverse, because stopping time can really help with getting past some late level challenges with the platforming. But at the end, the player will be unable to use the hour hand as a bridge to collect the star. Instead, the player will have to find a much more creative solution in reaching the platform holding the star, which requires mastery of the triple jump and dive in order to pull off. The dynamic nature of Tick-Tock Clock's platforming, which in turn makes its linear level design and challenges much more stimulating to engage in, is one of the best aspects of this course's design. It may have a hiccup or two along the way, most of which has to do with the game's camera, but despite that, it stands out as one of the most challenging, stimulating, and memorable levels from the whole game. And as is true to my masochistic tendencies when it comes to difficulty, it is also my very favorite from this entire game's catalog of courses. With that, we can now move on to the 15th and final course of Super Mario 64, Rainbow Ride. To me, this final course of Super Mario 64 perfectly encapsulates the duality of Super Mario 64's level design. Wild, open, experimental, unfinished, and riddled with both great and terrible ideas. To start with the great, many of Rainbow Ride's platforming sections are incredibly well crafted, offering a final chance for the player to utilize all the skills he's built up over the course of the game. There are 3 stars in particular that exemplify this great design, which are spread out between 2 different sections of the map. The first of these houses the red coin star, which requires that the player wall jump, long jump, somersault, and backflip his way through a massive vertical platforming maze in order to collect all 8 red coins. This section is also where the player can acquire the majority of the level's coins for the 100 coin star, but only through the perfect execution of this game's hardest maneuver, the wall kick. If you recall, we started the game with the simplest of wall kicks, all the way back in Course 4, but by this point of the game, the player is expected to have mastered the skill completely in order to quickly collect the blue coins leading up the maze, which will disappear if the player isn't able to quickly and accurately pull off this maneuver. This is, perhaps, an example of Rainbow Ride's greatest feat, challenging the player with a final, incredibly difficult iteration of a previously built upon mechanic like the wall kick just before the very end of the game. The second great section of this level houses another 2 stars, both of which lie at the end of a linear platforming gauntlet. One of the new additions to this level's design are these thin wooden platforms which fall if the player stays on them for too long. This forces the player to be careful, yet also quick with his movements, a demanding challenge which is no doubt befitting of this game's final course. The 2 stars are located at the end of 2 branching paths near the end of the platforming gauntlet. The first of these involves a large swing-like platform which the player will have to carefully jump on and off in order to reach the star. Brilliantly, the platform was introduced near the beginning of the linear section of challenges, but over a safety net, which allowed the player to familiarize himself with the concept before this final, much less forgiving iteration of the same concept. The second star continues with the wooden platforms from before, then presents a timed platforming challenge at the end. The player will need to hit a switch to make these pyramid-shaped platforms turn flat, then quickly ascend them in order to reach the star. These 2 separate sections of platforming challenges are perhaps some of the best examples of incremental difficulty done right in all of Super Mario 64. The smaller challenges and learning curves from the original 4 courses are all being put to the test here, and the player is expected to have mastered them by now. So this final level puts all the player's knowledge and skills to the test one final time before the end. This is Rainbow Ride at its best, one of the game's most open and challenging levels with a great many endgame challenges that put the player's skills to the test one final time. So now, with all of those positives out of the way, let's get to talking about one of the worst sections ever designed for a 3D platformer, the carpet ride.
No, Aladdin, I don't want to see the world.
Holy shit, is the carpet ride just one of the worst ideas in this entire game. It, and it alone, is the reason why so many people hate this one particular level, and I don't blame them. To explain what's so wrong with these carpets, let's start by talking about the fundamental element of a platformer that makes it so enthralling. Movement. All platformers are inherently movement-based. For most, it's really all they have to offer in terms of their gameplay loop. This can make the genre seem stale at first glance, and there certainly are a lot of stale platformers out there, but it also fosters the creation of a much more focused type of level design. You see, with such a hard focus on the movement, level design becomes much easier to understand and implement from a developer's perspective. I talk about Zelda all the time on this channel, and one thing I've learned from reviewing so many of those games is that dungeon design is a grueling process. You not only need to design an intuitive level layout for the overworld, but also design interior dungeons, enemy encounters, changing elements based on character abilities, and so much more that it becomes impossible to track at times. Platformers have it easy by contrast, because once a developer creates a character's moveset and implements the physics, levels simply need to serve as playgrounds for the character's movement, and create incremental challenges that test the player and fosters their mechanical growth over the course of the game. The best platformers all take this same approach. The second half of Rainbow Ride is the complete antithesis of this type of design. The final 3 stars of the level all require riding on carpets which move at a snail's pace, forcing the player to wait several minutes before finally making it to the next star. There is no challenge or lesson to take away from this, and the player has zero control over where he goes or what he does during these rides. They are simply several minute-long pauses in the flow of the level, which completely ruins its second half. And guess what? Death in this level means waiting on these damn carpets all over again. I want all the aspiring game developers watching this video right now to pay attention and hear this next statement. There is nothing more demoralizing for a player than having to wait several minutes before trying the same level over and over again. All because you designed it that way. That's what these carpets do. They create minute-long pauses in the game, force players to wait in order to reach the final 3 stars, and commit the very worst cardinal sin of game design possible, taking control away from the player. Do not ever do that to your player base. It never works. I'm surprised this level made it into the game as is. There are so many better examples of similar mechanics from this game, like the short elevator rides, which require careful platforming and constant jumps to navigate through. Or shoot, how about the wing cap? Even if this level couldn't have been redesigned because of the time constraints I mentioned earlier, why couldn't the developer have just added cannons and wing caps instead? That would have been easy for the developers to implement without making major changes to the pre-existing level design, and it would have kept the player's sense of freedom intact. I'm very conflicted about Rainbow Ride because I really do love its more linear sections. They really do fit as some of this game's final sets of platforming challenges, and are virtually flawless in execution. But there's this other part of the level which is just so misguided in its design that it completely kills all sense of momentum that the course otherwise may have had. It's a bittersweet note to end on as far as main course design goes. Luckily, on a much brighter note, there is still one more Bowser stage for us to talk about, and it's the best one yet. After collecting a minimum of 70 out of 120 stars, the player is allowed to challenge Bowser for the final time in his 3rd stage, Bowser in the Sky. As you might expect of the final level in the game, this 3rd Bowser stage is the longest by far, and draws level elements and platforming challenges from across the entire game in order to create one of the best level designs in all of Super Mario 64. There are moving platforms, seesaws, rotating platforms, poles, elevators, flamethrowers, and pretty much every other type of trap or challenge from the whole game. But these challenges aren't merely being recycled and haphazardly thrown in. Instead, they're deliberately spaced out so that each challenge leads into a slightly harder one, and so on until the player finally reaches the top of the level. The red coins are also spread throughout the level, tucked aside in little alcoves or floating just above the screen, requiring some searching on the player's part in order to find them all. The star that their collection nets will also be the very last in the game, which leads us to the last challenge of all, the final boss fight with Bowser. This is the only boss fight in the entire game that I would say is even remotely good. But beyond good, it's actually a pretty damn great fight, all things considered. The same concept from the previous two encounters applies. The player needs to grab Bowser by his tail and throw him into a bomb in order to win. This time, however, it does not take 1, but 3 successful throws in order to win. And beyond that, grabbing Bowser's tail is much harder than it was before. For one, Bowser's turn radius is much faster, as if he's grown more cautious of letting Mario get behind him. Simply outrunning him isn't going to do the trick this time. In addition, Bowser's fire breath is much deadlier compared to before, as it now branches out and sets the entire stage on fire. He also has a charge attack, a stomping attack, and will destroy parts of the stage as the fight progresses, giving the player less room to run around in. After 3 successful throws, Bowser is finally defeated, leaving Mario to fly back to the castle where Princess Peach now appears. She thanks Mario with a kiss on his giant, disgusting sphere of a nose and offers to bake him a cake. I'm going to let you fill in the blanks for yourself there. And the game finally ends. If you're a pussy-ass quitter. If you're a completionist like me, on the other hand, you're going to want to play this game for everything it's got. I already covered 108 of this game's 120 stars through the 3 Bowser levels and the 15 courses, but there's another 12 waiting in hidden sections of the castle. 2 of these you receive from chasing and catching a bunny down in the castle's basement, which famously was the very first bit of the game that Miyamoto had designed, so that he could play around with Mario's physics during the early portions of development. Another 3 stars are obtained from talking to certain Toad NPCs throughout the castle, and another 3 are acquired via red coin challenges that exist in this game's 3 cap stages, which the player must complete to unlock this game's 3 special caps. The final 4 stars are placed within miscellaneous bonus stages hidden throughout the castle. By collecting all 120 stars, you not only get some bonus dialogue from Bowser when he passively aggressively congratulates you on your accomplishment, but you also unlock the cannon sitting outside in the castle courtyard. Famously, you can use this cannon to launch Mario to the top of the castle, where the absolute shittiest 3D model of Yoshi will greet the player and congratulate him on his accomplishments, capping off his dialogue with a little message from the developers of Super Mario 64. Thank you for playing Super Mario 64. This is the end of the game, but not the end of the fun. Keep on playing. Upon its conclusion, Yoshi will hop off the roof of the castle and out of the game, and Mario will have his lives maxed out as a reward. It's such a simple little message for the developers to leave behind, but it's beautiful in that way. It captures perfectly the spirit of Super Mario 64, and shows that the developers understood the unique appeal of the game that they worked so hard on. Because Super Mario 64 is a game that deserves to be played forever. Not simply by a single player, not by me, not by you, but by everyone who plays video games. If there's one thing I've learned over the last 2 years of running this channel, it's that for as hopeless as the current gaming industry might seem at times, for as pandering or lazy or greedy as developers may come off as, there is always a better game out there that you've never played before. All you need to do is simply look to the past and take a chance, because more often than not, the classics of this medium, Super Mario 64 included, are truly worth playing, now and forever. Super Mario 64 is a beautiful game. It encapsulates many of the truly unique and special aspects that this medium has to offer, and exemplifies the very best of the 3D platformer genre. Shit, it pretty much invented the 3D platformer genre, and yet it still stands out amongst the very best that its caliber of game has to offer. That's a testament to the truly timeless nature of this product, and the perfection that Miyamoto and his team managed to achieve when it comes to the basic building blocks of Mario's controls and level layout. Because for all the shit I flung at this game for the last 2 hours, and for as many poor level designs we see pop up from time to time in Super Mario 64's runtime, none of them truly ever ruin the experience. Because the Super Mario 64 experience is intrinsically tied to that very singular, fundamental building block that I started this video discussing, and that Miyamoto began the development cycle improving: movement. The controls in this game are so airtight, and the levels so free, expansive, and complementary to the design of Mario's controls, that the game never ceases to amaze and entertain its players even at some of its lowest points. Yes, its story is completely bare bones. You won't come out of this with a life-changing tale that will broaden your perspective on life and leave you crying. This game is no Final Fantasy VII or Ocarina of Time in that regard. Yes, the level design has its flaws, which I've covered extensively, and they sometimes clash with Mario's movement. movement, like with Tiny Huge Island's physics or Rainbow Ride's boring carpet rides. And yes, the camera is not perfect, and you sometimes have to fight it or simply give in and attempt to jump with a less than optimal camera angle. All of these flaws are what they are. Blemishes, which, while yes, do slightly detract from the experience, still leave quite the gemstone of a game. This game is truly something special, the likes of which the gaming industry has never yet seen again. No Mario game, and no 3D platformer for that matter either, has since matched the heights of Super Mario 64. And boy, are the heights of Super Mario 64 truly great. Boundless skies, endless possibilities. Whatever you want Mario to do, you can make him do. There's something truly special to be said for a game that manages to instill in its player base that kind of freedom. To translate the player's actions into a character on screen so seamlessly is no small feat, which is likely why Super Mario 64 still remains so widely revered and critically acclaimed even a quarter century after its release. I love this game. It's certainly not my favorite game ever, nor is it perfect, but I think I finally understand the appeal of Mario because of it, and the appeal of 3D platformers in general. They aren't usually my cup of tea. In all 24 years of my life, they never had been. But the objectively incredible game design of Super Mario 64 and the perfection of the controls themselves truly won me over, and make this title stand out as one of the greatest video games of all time. I give Super Mario 64 a 9 out of 10. This game's control scheme and level designs are, for the most part, perfectly in sync, creating a platforming experience unlike any other, an infinitely replayable wonderland that will surely stick with players for as long as they live. But it does lack polish in some regards. A few levels feel incomplete, and it's easy to tell where cuts had to be made due to a lack of time on the part of the development team. And the story is, kind of a non sequitur really. It throws out concepts and terms that are in dire need of some explanation, and then doesn't care to explain them. Believe me, the last thing I was doing while playing this game was asking, when are the Toads finally gonna tell me what star power is? But just because I didn't expect a sensible story from a Mario game doesn't mean that it should get a pass for not doing anything with the concepts that it introduces. But in its totality, Super Mario 64 stands out as one of the most unique and incredible gaming experiences a gamer can ever have, and I wholeheartedly recommend it to anyone watching this video. Seriously, go fucking play it if you already haven't done so by now. Just make sure you use an original N64 controller or one of Nintendo's current reproductions for Switch Online, because honestly, you're doing this game a disservice if you play it any other way. The stick was literally designed for this game, and nothing else will ever feel right. Believe me, I'm the guy who just played this shit 5 times for the sake of this review. N64, or the Switch with an official N64 controller, is the only definitive way to play this game. And that's important, given just how vital freedom and control is to the Super Mario 64 experience. So, that was Super Mario 64. I hope you all enjoyed that. It was strange making a 2-hour video that wasn't Zelda related, or an Attack on Titan video that no one ever saw because production IG and Sony are run by dickbags. But either way, I worked real hard on this, and I hope my core audience appreciated it all the same. My channel lives and dies on your support, and I really do appreciate you guys sticking around and giving me feedback in the comments and on the Discord channel both. It really means a lot to me. Also, I'm really sorry that this took 7 fucking months to release. A lot has happened in that time, both personally and professionally, and well, there really is no excuse. I'm really sorry for that, guys. But I hope to have another shorter review out by the end of April, so hopefully you guys will stick around for that. Feel free to visit the Patreon page or simply give this video a like if you so desire. But regardless, thank you one and all so much for watching this video, and have yourselves a very nice day.